Nobody walks away from that lot with a Harley dealership for $13. The auctioneer said loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. Nobody's saying anyway. Luke Carter raised his hand anyway. The laughter started in the back row, moved forward like a wave. A broke, washed-up ex-Hell's Angel bidding on a condemned property with legal problems nobody wanted to touch. The man next to him actually patted his shoulder like he felt sorry. Luke didn't flinch. He'd been laughed at before. He'd survived worse than laughter. What none of them knew, what Luke himself didn't know yet, was that somewhere inside that dark, locked building, a dead man had already written his name. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this all the way to the end, because what happens inside that dealership is going to stay with you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Luke Carter showed up to the Missoula County auction, he had $26 in his wallet and a check engine light that had been glowing on his truck's dash for so long he'd stopped seeing it. He wasn't there for anything dramatic. He wasn't there for a miracle. He was there because someone on a local Facebook group had posted that unclaimed mechanic tools would be going for next to nothing, and Luke needed a decent torque wrench more than he needed almost anything else in his life at that particular moment. He parked his truck at the far end of the lot, walked across the gravel with his collar turned up against the October wind, and got himself a number card from the registration table. Number 47. He tucked it under his arm and stood at the edge of the crowd, not making eye contact with anyone, not making conversation. That was how he operated these days. Quietly, on the margins, taking up as little space as possible. The auction had maybe 80 people, which was large for a county lot sale in mid-October. Most of them were dealers, resellers, the usual scavengers who showed up to these things looking for cheap inventory they could flip. Luke recognized a few faces from the local mechanic community. A couple of them nodded at him. He nodded back. Nobody came over to talk. That was fine. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a fleece vest with the county seal on the chest, ran through the first dozen lots quickly. Power tools, filing cabinets, a commercial refrigeration unit, a pile of mismatched lumber. Luke watched the bidding without participating, tracking the prices in his head, recalculating what he could reasonably spend on a torque wrench and still afford gas for the next 2 weeks. The math was tight. It was always tight. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. All right, folks. This next one is a little unusual, he said, and something in his voice made the crowd settle. Lot 72, commercial property located at 4814 West Broadway, formerly the Whitmore Harley-Davidson dealership. The property has been in probate limbo for 11 years. County has cleared the title as of last month, which means today we can finally move it. There was a murmur through the crowd. Luke looked up. He'd driven past that building before. Everyone in Missoula had. It sat off the main commercial strip on a corner lot, a low-wide structure with a rusted sign still mounted above the entrance. The parking lot had cracked apart over the years, weeds splitting the asphalt. The windows were dark, the kind of dark that made a building look like it had given up. Now I have to be upfront with all of you, the auctioneer continued, and he put on the specific voice men use when they're delivering bad news. They want to sound neutral. The property comes with 3 outstanding municipal liens, a disputed easement claim on the eastern boundary, and pending environmental review for a lift pit that may or may not have a hydraulic fluid compliance issue. The county is selling this as is, no representations, no warranties, no cleanup obligation, transferring to the seller. Half the crowd was already shaking their heads. A dealer in a Carhartt jacket leaned to the man beside him and said loud enough to carry legal nightmare, not worth the headache. Opening bid is set at $13, the auctioneer said. Luke heard that and thought he'd misunderstood. $13 for a commercial property. He looked at the description sheet he'd been handed at registration and found lot 72 near the bottom. Whitmore Harley-Davidson, 4,814 West Broadway, approximately 8,400 square feet interior. Last assessed value prior to probate, $340,000. $13. He stared at the number for a long moment. The auctioneer looked out at the crowd. Do I have $13? Silence. Nobody moved. Luke thought about the torque wrench. He thought about the $26. He thought about the fact that he was 42 years old and living in a rented room above a Vietnamese restaurant, and his only real skill in the world was putting broken mechanical things back together. He raised his number card. 47, thank you, the auctioneer said. Do I have 14? No one moved. The auctioneer looked left, looked right, gave the crowd a full 10 seconds. Going once, going twice. He looked straight at Luke with something that might have been pity. Sold to number 47 for $13. The laughter came immediately. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly. It was more like the laughter people produce when they watch someone do something they genuinely cannot explain. A few people clapped sarcastically. The man in the Carhartt jacket shook his head slowly. Someone toward the back said, "That boy just bought himself a lawsuit." And the people around him agreed loudly. Luke walked to the registration table and signed the transfer documents. He handed over $13 in cash, a 10-2 singles a quarter he found in his jacket pocket, and the rest in loose change. He counted out onto the table one coin at a time, while the clerk watched him with an unreadable expression. "Congratulations," the clerk said in a tone that did not sound like congratulations. Luke pocketed the receipt and walked back to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a while without starting the engine. He didn't feel good about it. He didn't feel bad about it either. He felt something closer to stupidity, the specific dull ache of a decision made on pure instinct that hasn't yet revealed whether it was brilliance or disaster. He'd made enough of those decisions in his life to recognize the feeling. He drove to 4814 West Broadway. The county clerk had given him a key, a single old brass key on a plain ring, the kind that looks like it belongs to a different era. Luke sat in the parking lot and looked at the building for a while before he got out. The sign overhead, Whitmore Harley Davidson. The letters faded to almost nothing, moved slightly in the October wind on its mounting brackets. The parking lot was empty except for a rusted barrel near the side door that someone had once used for burning trash. He got out. He walked to the front entrance, a heavy commercial door with a deadbolt above the main lock, and tried the key. It fit the deadbolt first. The lock turned stiffly like it was surprised to be asked. Then the main lock. Then he gripped the handle and pulled. The smell hit him immediately, and it stopped him in the doorway. He'd expected abandonment. He'd expected mildew and rot and the particular sour smell of a building that had been sealed up with moisture inside for a decade. That was what 11 years of vacancy smelled like. He'd been inside enough abandoned spaces in his life to know exactly what he was walking into. But the smell that met him was something else entirely. Mineral oil, leather, the faint ghost of gunmetal grease, the layered, complex smell of a working mechanic's shop, not fresh but not dead either, preserved somehow, as if someone had spent considerable effort making sure this space didn't die the way abandoned places were supposed to die. Luke stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Then he reached to his right and found a light switch. He didn't expect it to work. He flipped it anyway. Fluorescent lights clicked on overhead, one row at a time, stuttering and buzzing before they settled into a steady glow. Not all of them worked. 4 or 5 fixtures remained dark, but enough came on to illuminate the space fully, and what Luke saw made him forget to move for what felt like a very long time. The showroom floor was covered in a decade's worth of dust, thick and undisturbed, lying in a gray layer across the concrete like a second floor. But beneath that dust, placed with what could only have been deliberate care, sat motorcycles. Old ones, a row of Harleys, some partially disassembled, some intact, some covered in canvas tarps that the dust had settled across, arranged along the walls of the showroom, as if someone had been in the middle of restoring them when the doors were locked for the last time. Parts bins lined one wall, organized and labeled. Workbenches held tools placed with a precision that spoke of someone who cared deeply about order. A chain hoist hung from a ceiling beam. The lift in the service bay, the same lift that appeared in the environmental review, was lowered to ground level with a Harley Sportster sitting on it mid-project, the engine partially disassembled, the components laid out on a clean shop rag in the order they had been removed. Like the man had simply stepped out for lunch and never come back. Luke walked through the space, slowly running his hand along a workbench, looking at the parts. He was a mechanic. He understood immediately what he was seeing. This was not neglect. This was someone who had maintained this space in secret long after the business officially closed, keeping it exactly the way they wanted it kept. He found the office at the back. A desk, filing cabinets, a chair behind the desk, leather cracked along the armrests. an old-style wall calendar showing February of 11 years ago. And against the far wall behind the desk, an old floor model steel safe, a good one, the kind with a combination dial and a secondary keyed lock, the kind of safe that costs real money and weighs enough that two men couldn't move it easily. Luke looked at the safe. The combination dial faced him, centered on the door, and the door itself was sealed tight. He tried the handle anyway, the way you try a door you already know is locked, just to confirm. It didn't move. Then he looked at the top of the safe. An envelope sat there. Old, cream-colored, the edges browned with age. Sealed. And across the front, in handwriting that had faded but was still completely legible, two words written in black ink for Luke. He picked it up. He turned it over. He looked at the front again because he thought he'd misread it. He hadn't. For Luke, his first name. Just his first name. His handwriting was not on this envelope. He had never been to this dealership before in his life. He had never met Arthur Whitmore. He'd barely known the name before today's auction listing. He could not account for why his name was on this envelope. He set it back down on top of the safe and stepped backward 2 full steps, which he was not conscious of doing until he felt the desk behind him. His heart was doing something he didn't like, not fear exactly, something more fundamental than fear. The specific sensation of a man who has just understood that something has been happening around him that he had no idea was happening. He picked the envelope back up. He opened it. The letter inside was written in the same hand as the envelope, deliberate, careful, slightly old-fashioned in its formation. 3 pages front and back written on plain white paper that had yellowed slightly at the margins. It began without greeting. If you're reading this, then the county finally cleared the title and the auction happened the way I planned, which means you bought this place. $13 isn't much, but I hope it was still something you had to stretch to spend. I wanted to make sure only someone who really needed it would bother. Investors don't raise their hands for $13. Only a man who has nothing to lose does. Luke lowered the pages. He read that paragraph again. The auction, the $13, the legal complications that scared everyone else away. He'd thought those were problems. They'd been designed. The legal complications were architecture built deliberately over years to make certain no investor would find this property worth the risk. The price was a filter. The whole thing had been constructed to ensure that the only person who would walk through that door was someone with almost nothing left. Someone like Luke. He kept reading. My name is Arthur Whitmore. You don't know me, but I know you. We met once 11 years ago in September on Route 200, just past the Clearwater Junction. My primary chain had snapped, and I was on the side of the road with a 1998 Electra Glide and no tools and a long way to go. You stopped. You didn't have to stop. I wasn't young, I wasn't in distress, and there was no particular reason for a man on a Road King with Hell's Angels patches to pull over for a stranger at 8 in the morning. But you stopped. Luke's hands had gone very still. He remembered that road. He remembered that morning, the early September light, the cold already coming into the air at elevation Route 200, running flat and straight through the valley. He remembered the man on the side of the road because he'd been an older man, maybe 65, with the kind of lean, angular build that meant he'd worked physically his whole life. Luke had pulled over without really thinking about it. He'd carried a basic chain tool in his saddlebag. He'd replaced the chain section well enough to get the man to Missoula, refused the money the man had tried to press on him 3 different times, and ridden away without asking his name. He hadn't thought about it again. It was one of 10,000 small moments that constitute a life. It had seemed like nothing. You wouldn't take money. Arthur's letter continued. I tried twice. You said, and I wrote this down the same day because I didn't want to forget it exactly. You said, you needed help. That's enough. Then you got back on your bike and rode away. I sat on that roadside for another 20 minutes thinking about those 5 words. I'm 71 years old and I have met a great many people and very few of them have surprised me. You surprised me. Luke put the letter down on the desk and pressed his hand flat against the surface and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. The thing was, and this was the part that made his throat tight, he had not been a good man at that point in his life. Or he hadn't felt like one. 11 years ago, he had been in the process of doing the hardest thing he had ever done, which was slowly extracting himself from the chapter in a way that didn't get him killed and didn't compromise people who didn't deserve to be compromised. He had spent 3 years navigating the most dangerous social architecture he'd ever encountered, quietly protecting a family who had no idea they needed protecting, bleeding money and reputation and safety to do it. And by September of that year, he had succeeded. Technically, they were safe, but he had lost nearly everything else in the transaction. Respect inside the chapter, his position, friends who no longer trusted him. He had been riding Route 200 that morning because he'd needed to go somewhere that wasn't any particular place, because the grief of his situation had finally located him and he'd needed to outrun it for a while. And on that ride, he'd stopped for an old man with a broken chain. Because you stop, that's all. You see someone who needs a hand and you stop. He picked up the letter again. I spent 6 months after that morning having you investigated, Arthur wrote. Not by law enforcement, I have my own resources. I needed to understand who you were. What I found wasn't what people said about you. People said you were a fallen biker who'd made bad choices and burned his bridges. What I found was a man who had made enormously costly choices on behalf of people who never knew he'd made them. A family in Billings who have no idea that the reason they're still intact is because of what you did and what it cost you. I won't name them here, but I know what you did and I know what it cost. Luke had to stop reading again. He walked to the office window, dark the glass painted over from the outside, and pressed his forehead against the cool surface. He breathed. Once, twice. Nobody knew about the family. That was the point. That was the whole point. He hadn't done it for credit. He'd done it because it was right and because someone had to, and because he was the one who happened to be in the position to do it. He had accepted the cost. He had never expected recognition. That a dead man had seen it anyway, had spent 6 months quietly excavating the truth of it, undid something in Luke's chest that he hadn't known was still knotted tight. He returned to the letter. By the time I finished my investigation, I was 83 years old in my spirit, if not in my body, and I had a decision to make about this building and everything it contains. I had one son, and he was not a good man. I will not elaborate. I had no other family. I had spent 40 years building something here that was not what it appeared to be from the outside, and I needed to leave it to someone who would understand what it was actually for. I chose you. The key on the top shelf of the first parts cabinet, to the left of the main service entrance, opens the safe. The combination is the date on the calendar in this office, day, month, year, 6 digits. Inside, you will find the financial documents, the trust documentation, the legal correspondence, and the journals. Read the journals first. Everything else will make more sense afterward. I know you'll have questions. My attorney, a woman named Sandra Okafor, has been waiting for this letter to be opened for 11 years. She will contact you within 48 hours of your opening this door. She has an alarm on the system. She will explain what I was not able to put in writing. I have one request, not a legal condition. I've done enough of those. This is just a request from one man to another. Don't sell the motorcycles. They're not worth what people will tell you they're worth. What's worth something is still breathing, and it's waiting for you to open the journals. Arthur Whitmore P. asked the Sportster on the lift. Engine is mostly reassembled. I left it for someone else to finish. The final torque sequence is on the index card under the left cylinder head. Shouldn't take you more than 2 hours if you know what you're doing. I have a feeling you know what you're doing. Luke stood in the office for a long time after he finished the letter. He read it again. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope in the center of the desk. He walked to the service bay and found the first parts cabinet to the left of the main entrance. Top shelf, a small brass key on a plain ring. He walked back to the safe. He dialed the combination, day, month, year from the calendar on the wall. The mechanism turned each number clicking into place with the solid precision of a safe that had been built to last. The keyed lock took the small brass key. He turned it. The safe swung open. Inside on the left side were 3 stacks of journals, composition notebooks, the kind with the black marbled covers stacked neatly and bound in pairs with rubber bands. On the right side, a thick folder of documents in manila envelopes, each labeled in Arthur's careful handwriting. Financial records, trust documentation, legal correspondence, property deeds. Luke took a journal off the top of the first stack. He opened it to the first page. Arthur had written a name at the top of the page, then a date 11 years earlier, then a story, a paragraph not long, about a man named Dale Reeves who'd come in looking for work when his construction company had laid him off and he had a daughter starting community college. Arthur had given him a job doing deliveries. Below that, 6 months later, Dale Reeves passed his journeyman mechanic exam. Hired full-time. Daughter finished first-year dean's list. Luke turned the page. Another name, another date. A woman, this time Rita Solis, 44 years old, escaping a bad marriage, with 2 boys and no credit history. Arthur had co-signed a lease for her. 6 months later, Rita opened a seamstress business out of her apartment, made her first rent payment on her own 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Luke turned pages, page after name after name. Some stories ran a paragraph. Some ran 2 pages. Some had follow-up entries years later, where people had gone what they'd built, whether they knew Arthur had helped them or not. Most didn't know. Most never would. The first journal covered 43 people. Luke opened the second. He was still reading when the afternoon light shifted, and he realized he'd been in the building for 4 hours without moving. He set the journal down and looked around the office. He looked at the stack of remaining journals. He counted them 12. 12 journals? He did the rough math. If each journal held 40 to 50 people on average, and there were 12 journals, he sat back in the chair. The leather creaked. Outside, a truck rolled past on West Broadway. He heard it through the painted-over windows, the engine noise, then the diminishing Doppler of it moving away. Missoula going about its day, people driving to grocery stores and picking up kids from school and filling gas tanks and arguing about dinner, all of them completely unaware that somewhere in this building, written in a dead man's careful hand, were the names of hundreds of people whose lives had been quietly redirected by a mechanic who decided that the best thing a person could do with a business was use it to rebuild the people around them. Luke picked up the first journal again. He kept reading. He was on journal 3 when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. He answered. Is this Luke Carter? A woman's voice, professional, I measured. The voice of someone who'd been waiting for this call for a very long time. Yeah, he said. My name is Sandra Okafor. I'm Arthur Whitmore's attorney. I have a monitoring alert on the dealership entry system. I understand you opened the building today. I did. A brief pause. Did you find the letter? I found it. And the journals. I'm reading them. Another pause, this one different in quality from the first. Not hesitation, more like someone setting something down carefully. Mr. Carter, I've been waiting 11 years for this call. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I say it because I want you to understand that everything inside that building was placed there with extraordinary deliberateness. Arthur spent years on this. Years. She stopped herself. I'm sorry, I've been holding this for a long time. Take your time, Luke said. He was a remarkable man, she said quietly, and he was very certain about you. He didn't know me. He knew more about you than you might be comfortable with, she said. But that's a conversation for when we meet in person. What I need to tell you tonight is this. There's a trust, a substantial one, and it's been waiting for your name to be on that deed before it can activate. As of this afternoon, your name is on that deed. Luke was quiet. How substantial, he asked. She told him. He was quiet for a much longer time after that. Mr. Carter, she said finally, are you still there? I'm here, he said. I need a minute. Of course, he got up from the chair and walked out of the office and stood in the middle of the showroom floor surrounded by dusty Harleys in a decade of careful preservation, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, the October dark pressing against the painted windows. He thought about $13. He thought about $26. He thought about a man on the side of Route 200 on a cold September morning. Miss Okafor, he said. Yes. The trust, there's a condition on it. Yes, she said. There is. What does the condition require? She paused. That the dealership continue operating according to the mission Arthur built it for. Specifically, employment opportunities, apprenticeships, emergency support. It's detailed in the documentation. You'll want to read it carefully. But the short version is if you use the building and the trust the way Arthur intended, the trust remains active and fully funded. If you sell the property or change the mission, it goes away. The trust dissolves and the funds revert to the state, she confirmed. Luke nodded, though she couldn't see him. He looked at the row of Harleys, the workbench, the Sportster on the lift with its engine half assembled, waiting 11 years for someone to finish the torque sequence. I'll be in my office tomorrow morning, she said. Will you come in? Yeah, he said. I'll be there. He hung up. He stood in the showroom for another long moment. Then he walked to the service bay crouched next to the Sportster on the lift and found the index card under the left cylinder head. The torque sequence was written out in Arthur's hands step by step, nothing left to ambiguity. Luke got his tools from his truck. He came back inside. He worked until 11 o'clock that night by the light of the fluorescent fixtures, hands moving through the familiar sequence of the engine reassembly, the torque wrench clicking at spec on each fastener, the components settling into their proper relationships, the machine becoming coherent again under his hands. He worked the way he always worked, which was quietly and completely without music, without distraction. Just the work and the sound of metal and the smell of clean engine oil. At 11, he set the wrench down. He stood back. He looked at the Sportster. Complete now, ready to run. An engine that had been waiting 11 years for someone to finish what Arthur had started. He walked to the wall and switched the lights off. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he walked out, locked the door behind him with the brass key and got in his truck. He drove back to the room above the Vietnamese restaurant. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the letter, about Route 200, about 5 words he'd said without thinking to a man he'd never expected to see again. He thought about the journals, about Dale Reeves and Rita Solis, and 43 people in the first book, and 40-some in the second, and 40-some in the third, and 9 more books after that, all of them. People whose lives had been quietly, invisibly redirected by a mechanic with a simple idea about what a business was actually for. He thought about the trust, the number Sandra Okafor had said on the phone, the condition that came with it. He thought about Victor Harlan. He didn't know that name yet. That was still coming. There was a storm still out past the horizon that he couldn't see yet, and it was going to arrive with all the force of everything that money and power and reputation could bring to bear against one man who just signed a $13 deed. He didn't know that yet. What he knew lying on his back in the dark above a Vietnamese restaurant with $26 minus $13 in his wallet and a check engine light he'd been ignoring for 3 months was something quieter and more private and harder to name. He knew that somewhere in Missoula, in a building that smelled of mineral oil and preserved time, 12 composition notebooks sat stacked in a steel safe, each one full of names, each name a life, each life a small private act of someone who had decided not once but again and again and again over 40 years that the best use of what he'd built was other people. And he knew that a dead man he'd never properly met had spent 11 years arranging events so that the right person would walk through the right door and find them. Luke Carter turned onto his side. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep for a long time. But when he did, he slept without the particular weight that had been pressing on his chest every night for as long as he could remember, the weight of a life that had taken more than it had given, of choices that had cost everything and earned nothing visible, of a man who had done the right thing in the dark and waited in vain for it to mean something. Tonight, for the first time in years, it meant something. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with that. But for one night in the dark, above the quiet smell of foam rising through the floorboards, that was enough. Sandra Okafor's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Higgins Avenue, and when Luke walked in at 8:50 the next morning, she was already standing at her desk with a coffee in one hand and a phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low, rapid voice that stopped the moment she saw him. She held up one finger. He sat down. She finished the call in under 30 seconds, set the phone face down on the desk, and looked at him the way people look at someone they've been rehearsing for. "You're earlier than I expected," she said. "I don't sleep much," Luke said. She sat down across from him. She was maybe 60, with close-cropped silver hair, in the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades being the person in the room that other people brought their worst problems to. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at him directly, and he appreciated that. He'd been looked at sideways enough in his life to know the difference. "Before we get into the documents," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you read the letter last night, what was your first reaction?" "Not the considered one. The first one." Luke thought about it honestly. "I thought someone was playing a joke on me. And then I thought I was losing my mind. And then I read the journals," he said, "and I stopped thinking about myself." Sandra nodded slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something she'd already suspected. She opened the folder in front of her and slid a document across the desk, 12 pages dense with legal language. Arthur Whitmore's name appearing in every third line. The Arthur Whitmore Charitable Trust, she said. Established 31 years ago, funded incrementally through dealership profits over 4 decades. Of last month's valuation, she tapped a line near the bottom of the first page. $3.8 million. Luke looked at the number. He'd heard it on the phone the night before, but seeing it printed was different. It occupied more space on a page than it had in the air. The trust has 3 conditions, Sandra continued. First, the dealership must remain operational as a working motorcycle service business. Not a museum, not a collector, showroom, operational. Second, employment and apprenticeship programs must be maintained according to the guidelines Arthur specified, which are detailed in Appendix C. Third, no less than 60% of the trust's annual disbursements must go directly to the programs. The remaining 40% covers operational costs. And if I violate any of those conditions, the trust dissolves immediately and the full amount reverts to the state general fund. She said it without drama, just the plain weight of the fact. Arthur was very deliberate about that. He did not want the money to be useful to someone who wasn't using it the right way. Luke leaned back in his chair. What happens to the 3 liens on the property? The trust covers them. That's one of the first disbursements once you formally accept. She slid another document across. There's also the environmental review. The lift pit issue is straightforward, a hydraulic fluid seal from 1998 that never met updated EPA standards. Estimated remediation cost is around $9,000. Trust covers that too. So the $13 actually cost me $4 million. Sandra almost smiled. Or it bought you $4 million, depends on how you look at it. How did Arthur look at it? She was quiet for a moment. Arthur looked at it as finding the right person, she said. The money was never the point. The money was just the tool. He spent 11 years making sure the tool got to someone who understood what it was for. Luke looked at the documents. He thought about what he was being asked to make on. A building he didn't own yesterday. A trust he hadn't known existed. Programs that would require staff and structure and administration and knowledge he didn't have. Legal obligations, financial responsibilities. All of it inherited from a man he'd spoken to once on the side of a road for 40 minutes 11 years ago. I need to ask you something, he said. Of course. Did you ever think the right person wasn't going to show up? Sandra was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he knew the answer before she gave it. Last year, she said, when the probate dragged into its 10th year, and the county was talking about condemning the property for back taxes, yes. I thought we might have run out of time. She looked at her hands. I told Arthur when he was still alive that the plan had too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. He told me, she paused, he told me that the right person would show up exactly when they needed to, not before, not after. He said people who are ready for something difficult usually arrive at it when they have nothing left to lose. Luke thought about $26, about a torque wrench he'd been planning to buy. He was right about that part, Luke said. He signed the acceptance documents. Sandra walked him through every page, the trust activation, the lien settlement authorization, the property transfer confirmation, the program guidelines in Appendix C. She didn't rush him. She answered every question he had and several he hadn't thought to ask. By the time they finished, it was past noon, and Luke's hand ached from signing, and his head was full of language that would take days to fully process. At the door, Sandra shook his hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake. He chose well, she said. Luke nodded once and walked out. He drove directly to the dealership. He let himself in with the brass key and stood in the showroom for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the fluorescent light, letting the smell of mineral oil and old leather recalibrate something in him the way it had the day before. Then he walked to the office, sat in Arthur's chair, and opened Journal 4. He read for 6 hours. By the time he finished Journal 7, the pattern Arthur had built was fully visible to him, and it was not what he'd expected. It wasn't charity. That was the critical distinction. Arthur had never given anyone a handout in the way people typically meant the word. What he'd given was access to tools, to knowledge, to employment, to someone willing to co-sign a lease, or make a phone call, or sit across a desk and say with complete sincerity that they believed a person was capable of more than their current circumstances suggested. He'd given people a footing, a place to stand, and then he'd gotten out of the way. Luke was on Journal 8 when he heard the knock at the front door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He'd been so deep in the reading that the knock startled him genuinely, a sharp, impatient knock, the kind that doesn't apologize for itself. He set the journal down and walked through the showroom to the front entrance and opened it. Two men, both in leather, both wearing patches Luke recognized from a chapter based out of Billings men he'd known by face, if not well by name, from years he'd spent inside the organization before everything changed. The one in front was called Bridges, a man in his late 50s with a thick gray beard and the kind of eyes that calculated constantly. Behind him was a younger man Luke didn't recognize. Luke Carter, Bridges said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an identification. Bridges, Luke said. Word got out about the auction, Bridges said. Figured we'd come see for ourselves. See what? Bridges looking past him into the showroom. His eyes moved across the motorcycles, the workbenches, the parts bins with the specific focus of a man doing rapid inventory. What you got here, he said. A building, Luke said. A building with a lot of iron in it, Bridges said, and a reputation. Whitmore's place. We knew about Whitmore. Did you? Man was a legend in certain circles. Bikes he worked on went for serious money. Bridges brought his gaze back to Luke. There's talk about a collection. Vintage machines. People are saying there might be significant value in there. Luke looked at him steadily. He'd navigated conversations like this one before in rooms with higher stakes and worse outcomes. He knew exactly what was happening. He felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. There are motorcycles, Luke said. They're not for sale. Bridges cocked his head slightly. Not for sale? Not for sale? A beat. Bridges looked at the younger man behind him, then back at Luke. Luke, you paid $13 for this place. We're talking about machines that are worth... I know what they're worth, Luke said. They're not for sale. That's a significant decision to make on day 2. It's not a hard decision, Luke said. Just significant. Something moved behind Bridges' eyes, not anger yet, but its precursor, the mild offense of a man who'd expected a different conversation. I'm trying to give you an opportunity here, he said. There are collectors who've been waiting for these machines to surface for a decade. You could walk away from this tomorrow with enough to... I'm not walking away, Luke said. Luke, I appreciate you coming out, Luke said, and he meant it to be final because it was. But we're done with this part of the conversation. Bridges studied him for another moment. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information away rather than accepting defeat. All right, he said, we'll talk again. Maybe, Luke said. He closed the door. He stood on his side of it and listened to the sound of 2 motorcycles starting and pulling away. And he thought about the word maybe, and he thought about the word again, and he understood that this was not the last of that conversation. It was the first. He went back to the journals. Journal 8 documented a period Arthur had called his expansion years, the decade when he'd quietly extended the dealership's reach beyond direct employment into a network of informal partnerships with other local businesses, a community college instructor who ran night classes, a veterans counselor who sent men and women who needed to work with their hands. The names in Journal 8 were different in texture from the earlier ones, more complex histories, harder starting points, longer arcs. One entry stopped him. The name at the top was Marcus Webb. The date was 9 years ago. Below it, Arthur had written former corrections. 3 years served, released with $40 and a bus ticket. Referred by Connolly at the Veterans Center, not a vet, but same situation. Gave him the floor sweep job first week. Watched him work. In 6 months, I gave him the shop keys. He never once came in late. Left 2 years later to open his own shop in Kalispell. Called me on my birthday every year until I got too old to use the phone properly. Luke turned the page. I never told Marcus why I gave him the floor sweep job that first week, instead of the application and interview process I used for everyone else Arthur had written. The truth was, I looked at him standing in my parking lot, and I saw someone who had already done the hardest thing, who had already failed in the most public way a person can fail and come out the other side still standing. People who've survived their worst moment are often the ones most worth investing in. They know what rock bottom looks like. They don't want to go back. Luke read that paragraph 3 times. He was 42 years old. He had spent years drifting between rented rooms and repair jobs, carrying a history that most people judged before they understood it. He had been for a long time the kind of man that other men looked past, the kind of man you didn't expect to find signing ownership documents for a $4 million trust on a Tuesday afternoon. Arthur had looked at Marcus Webb standing in a parking lot and seen something no one else bothered to look for. Luke understood reading it that Arthur had done the same thing on Route 211 years ago, had pulled the same lens out and applied it to a biker on the shoulder of a highway who'd stopped for a stranger and refused payment, had seen past the patches, past the reputation, past the visible story to the actual man underneath. He closed Journal 8. He sat in Arthur's chair in Arthur's office for a long time without moving. Then his phone rang. Unknown number again, but this time not a local area code. He answered. Is this the owner of the Whitmore property? Madam. The voice was male smooth with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to conversations going the way they wanted them to go. It is, Luke said. My name is Victor Harlan. I'm a businessman here in Missoula. I've been following the Whitmore property situation for several years, and I understand it transferred at auction yesterday. Luke said nothing. He waited. I'd like to meet with you, Harlan said, at your earliest convenience. I have a proposition that I think you'll find extremely interesting given your current situation. The pause before current situation was very small. Small enough that a less attentive man might not have noticed it. Luke noticed it. What kind of proposition, Luke said. The kind that's better discussed in person. I can come to the property if that's easier for you. It's not, Luke said. A brief silence. I could have my assistant arrange something at my office. I know where your office is, Luke said, which wasn't true, but the confidence of it served its purpose. Give me a few days. I'll call you. Of course, Harlan said, and his voice had shifted by a degree or two, still smooth but cooler now. I'll look forward to it. Luke hung up. He typed Victor Harlan into the search bar on his phone. What came back in the first 30 seconds told him it enough. Commercial real estate developer. Large holdings across western Montana. 3 properties on West Broadway within a half-mile of the dealership. City council relationships documented in local news coverage. The kind of man who positioned himself adjacent to county government the way other men position themselves adjacent to money, because adjacent to county government was the same thing. Luke set his phone down. He looked at the wall where Arthur's calendar still showed February. He thought about 11 years of deliberate legal complexity. The liens, the disputed easement, the environmental review. He thought about them differently now than he had yesterday morning. Yesterday they had looked like problems. Now they looked like 11 years of someone making sure that a particular type of person could not easily acquire this property. Arthur had known men like Victor Harlan. Arthur had spent over a decade making this building as unattractive to them as possible, and it had worked right up until yesterday when a man with $26 in his wallet had raised his hand for $13, and the legal protection Arthur had built suddenly became Luke's problem to defend. He got up and walked to the window and stood there with his hands in his pockets. He didn't know yet what Harlan's specific approach would be. He didn't know about the lawsuit which was still being drafted in an office across town. He didn't know that by the end of the week, 3 different reporters would call him, or that a photograph of the dealership would appear in a regional business journal with a headline about the mysterious Harley collection, or that 2 collectors from out of state would drive to Missoula specifically to knock on the door he was now responsible for keeping locked. What he knew standing at the window in the afternoon quiet was that something Arthur had spent 40 years protecting was now his to protect. He thought about the journals, about Dale Reeves, about Rita Solis, about Marcus Webb and his floor sweep job and his birthday calls, about hundreds of names spread across 12 composition notebooks, each name a person who had found a foothold in the world because an old mechanic had seen past their worst circumstances to what they were actually capable of. He thought about Arthur's letter, "Don't sell the motorcycles." And then he thought about something else. Something that had been sitting at the back of his mind since he'd finished Journal 3 the night before. Something that he hadn't fully articulated to himself until this moment. Arthur's mission hadn't ended when Arthur died. It had paused. It had been sitting in the dark of a locked building for 11 years waiting. Every person who could have walked through that door during those 11 years, every investor, every developer, every collector had looked at the legal complications and the price and walked away. And the mission had waited, patient as a wound spring, waiting for the one person who would raise their hand for $13 and mean it. Luke went back to the desk and picked up his phone and called Sandra Okafor. She answered on the second ring. I have a question about the trust document, he said. Of course. The employment programs, the guidelines in Appendix C. How specific are they? Fairly specific, she said. Arthur was detailed about the criteria. Veterans returning citizens, recovering addicts, single parents, people facing structural barriers to traditional employment. The apprenticeship component requires formal skills training. He outlined minimum program standards. What he didn't outline, Luke said, is how I'm supposed to run a dealership, because I've never run a business in my life. A pause, then no, he didn't outline that. So that part's on me. That part is on you, she confirmed. Okay, Luke said. That's all you wanted to ask. One more thing, he said. A man named Victor Harlan called me about an hour ago. The pause on Sandra's end was longer this time. I see. You know who he is? Yes, she said. Victor Harlan has been circling that property for 7 years. He made 2 attempts to acquire it during the probate. Neither succeeded because Arthur structured the title in Bernay that made third-party acquisition during probate essentially impossible. He knows that building's assessed history. He believes there's a collection of vintage Harleys inside that are worth significantly more than their market value because of their provenance. Is he right? About the collection's value, possibly. Some of those machines are genuinely rare. A beat. About his ability to acquire them, no. The trust conditions make the motorcycles effectively non-transferable as long as the dealership is operational. He doesn't know about the trust. Almost certainly not, she said. The trust documentation was sealed as part of the probate. It becomes public record now that it's been activated, but as of this morning, no one outside this office and yourself knows the full details. Luke nodded slowly. So he's going to come at the property thinking it's just a building with valuable motorcycles and a new owner who doesn't have the resources to fight him. That would be my assessment, Sandra said. How wrong is he? Sandra allowed herself a moment before answering. He has significant resources and legal experience. You have the trust and 11 years of Arthur's preparation behind you. It won't be a comfortable fight, Mr. Carter. But Arthur didn't design this to lose. Luke looked at the journals stacked on the desk. All right, he said, I need a favor. If I can, I need someone who knows business operations, not corporate small business. Someone who understands how a shop like this actually runs payroll, scheduling, inventory, all of it. Arthur's program guidelines are good, but they assume someone already knows how to run the underlying operation. I may know someone, Sandra said. A woman named Carolyn Marsh. She ran a small manufacturing operation in Helena for 20 years before she retired. She was one of Arthur's. She was someone Arthur helped years ago. She knows about him. She might be willing to consult. Can you call her? I can call her tonight. Thank you, Luke said. He hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he opened Journal 9. The first name in Journal 9 was a woman named Patricia Dunn, 62 years old at the time of the entry, a widow whose husband had left her with substantial debt and no marketable skills, and 2 grandchildren in her care because their mother had lost custody. Arthur had found Patricia through a church referral. He'd hired her to handle bookkeeping despite the fact that she had no formal accounting experience, because he'd spent 45 minutes talking to her and determined that she was meticulous, honest, and capable of learning anything she needed to learn if someone gave her the space to learn it. 3 years later, Patricia Dunn was managing the dealership's full financial operation. Luke kept reading. He read until 9 at night. When he finally set the journal down and rubbed his eyes, he'd read the histories of 60 more people. The arithmetic was becoming real to him in a way that the total number hadn't fully conveyed. Each name was a life that had intersected with Arthur's dealership and been redirected. Each redirection had ripple effects that Arthur sometimes tracked in follow-up entries, children who had stayed in school, grandchildren who'd been born into more stable circumstances, marriages that had survived because the financial pressure had been relieved at the right moment. The journals were not a record of charity. They were a record of compounding. One person stabilized a household, stabilized a family, sometimes stabilized an entire adjacent network of people connected to that family. Arthur had understood that the point of entry was never the end of the story. It was the beginning. Luke understood reading it why Arthur had spent 40 years at this. Not because it was easy. Because once you saw the compounding effect of one genuine act of practical support, you couldn't unsee it. He locked up the building and drove home. In the room above this restaurant, he lay on his back in the dark again. But this time he wasn't thinking about Arthur's letter, or the trust, or the number Sandra had given him on the phone. He was thinking about Bridges at the door that afternoon, the way his eyes had moved across the machines, calculating value, seeing inventory. He was thinking about Victor Harlan's voice on the phone, that small pause before current situation, the particular confidence of a man who had never encountered an obstacle that money couldn't resolve. He was thinking about what it meant to protect something. He'd done it before, quietly, expensively, at great personal cost in a context where no one would ever know, and where the people being protected had no idea protection was even happening. He understood that work. He understood what it required. What it required was not matching the other person's force. That was a losing game when the other person had more resources than you did. What it required was understanding what they were actually coming for, and making sure that thing was either unavailable to them or not what they believed it to be. Victor Harlan believed he was coming for valuable motorcycles held by a broke, isolated man with no legal resources and no community support. He was wrong on multiple counts. He just didn't know that yet. Luke stared at the ceiling. He thought about the journals, about 12 notebooks full of people who'd been given a foothold when they needed one, about hundreds of lives redirected by one man's persistent belief that the best use of what he'd built was other people, about Arthur's letter sitting in its cream-colored envelope on the desk, about a 1998 Electra Glide on the side of Route 200 on a cold September morning, about 5 words he'd said without thinking to a stranger he'd never expected to see again. He turned onto his side. Outside, Missoula was quiet. October quiet, the particular stillness of a city between seasons, holding its breath before the cold fully arrived. Luke Carter closed his eyes. Tomorrow he was going to open the dealership's front door for the first time in 11 years. Not to collectors, not to developers, not to men from Billings doing inventory with their eyes. He was going to open it the way Arthur had left it, as a working shop, as a place where someone who needed a foothold could find one. He didn't know yet what that looked like practically. He didn't know the operations or the staffing or the program structure or how to field a phone call from a reporter or what to say to Victor Harlan when they finally sat across a table from each other. He knew how to rebuild broken engines. He knew how to read a man's intentions from the way he stood in a doorway. He knew what it cost to protect something worth protecting. That was enough to start. He slept. Carolyn Marsh showed up at 7:30 in the morning, 2 days after Sandra called her driving a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield and a backseat full of binders. She was 64, compact and direct, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and the manner of someone who had spent 2 decades making decisions under pressure and had stopped being impressed by difficult situations somewhere around year 5. She walked through the front door, looked at the showroom for exactly 30 seconds, and said, "How long before the lift pit issue is resolved?" "Environmental contractor comes Thursday," Luke said. "Good. You need that bay operational within 2 weeks, or you can't take on service work, and without service revenue, you are running entirely on trust disbursements, which makes you look like a charity operation instead of a functioning business." Arthur understood the difference. She set her largest binder on the workbench. "He made me understand it too about 23 years ago when I was sitting in an office very much like this one with no idea what I was doing." Luke looked at her. "You were in one of the journals." "Journal 6, she said without particular emotion. "Page 31 if you want to verify." She flipped the binder open. "I'm not here because of sentiment, Mr. Carter. I'm here because Arthur's mission is the best thing I ever saw work in my life, and I watched it nearly die with him, and I am not interested in watching it die again. So let's get to it." They worked for 6 hours straight. Carolyn had brought 11 years of dormant operational knowledge, everything she'd observed during her own time connected to Arthur's network, everything she'd built in her own business afterward, everything she'd kept organized in those binders for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself until Sandra's phone call. She knew supply chains for Harley parts. She knew which local community college programs produced the kind of apprenticeship candidates Arthur's guidelines described. She knew the difference between the paperwork structure that made a charitable employment program legally defensible and the kind that collapsed under scrutiny. She also knew Arthur's system in ways Luke hadn't expected. "He didn't advertise," she said, "not once in 40 years. Every person who walked through that door came through a referral network, Counselors, pastors, parole officers, teachers, social workers. People who knew Arthur trusted his discretion. That's what you have to rebuild before you can do anything else. The referral network is more important than the service bays. How do I rebuild something I didn't build in the first place? Luke asked. You meet people, she said simply. You show up. You call the Veterans Center on Reserve Street and you introduce yourself and you tell them what this place is for. You call the women's shelter on Brooks. You call the community college and ask for the workforce development coordinator. You don't pitch them, you listen. You find out what gaps exist and you tell them honestly whether you can fill them. She looked at him over her reading glasses. Arthur was a mechanic, not a social worker. He had no particular training in any of this. He just paid attention and showed up consistently over 40 years. That's the whole secret. That doesn't sound like a secret, Luke said. No, she agreed, it doesn't. Most important things don't. By noon, they had a rough operational framework, service-based schedule, initial staffing plan, a priority list for which referral contacts to approach first. Carolyn committed to 3 days a week for the first 2 months, which she called the scaffolding period. After that, she said Luke would either have the structure or he wouldn't. She was packing her binders when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, a number he didn't recognize but a 406 area code local. He answered, Mr. Carter. A different voice this time, not Harlan, younger with the clipped precision of someone in a professional role they'd worked hard to occupy. My name is Daniel Pruitt. I'm an attorney with Harlan Commercial Properties. I'm calling to inform you that my client has filed a civil complaint in Missoula County District Court challenging the validity of the auction transfer dated October 14th. Luke was quiet for a moment. Carolyn had stopped moving. On what grounds? Luke said. Multiple grounds, Pruitt said. My client contends that the county failed to meet statutory notification requirements prior to the auction, that the assessed value used to establish the opening bid was procedurally deficient, and that the auction itself did not conform to Montana Code annotated requirements for commercial property disposition. Luke looked at Carolyn. She had her phone out and was already texting someone. And what does your client want? Luke said. My client wants the transfer voided and the property returned to open auction under proper procedures, Pruitt said. He's prepared to offer a courtesy settlement, a payment of $60,000 to you in exchange for voluntary deed surrender, which would avoid what could be a lengthy and expensive litigation process. $60,000. The number hit Luke somewhere practical and immediate. $60,000 was more money than he'd seen in any consecutive 3 years of his life. He felt it register in his body the way physical things register before his mind could get in front of it. He made sure his voice gave none of that away. I'll pass your filing information to my attorney, he said. She'll be in touch. Of course, Pruitt said with the tone of someone who expected that response and had already prepared for it. I'll email the complaint documents to whatever address you provide. Luke gave him Sandra's office email and hung up. Carolyn looked at him. Harlan filed. Fast, Luke said. I haven't even had the property for a week. He's been ready for years, Carolyn said. He's been waiting for that title to clear so he'd have someone to sue. The county was judgment-proof during probate. You're not. She was already calling Sandra. She handed the phone to Luke when Sandra picked up. I heard, Sandra said. Luke hadn't even said anything. Daniel Pruitt's office called mine 20 minutes ago with the courtesy notice. I've been pulling the auction documentation. How bad is it? Manageable, she said. The notification argument is weak. The county ran the statutory notices correctly. I checked the filings this morning. The assessed value argument has more surface area, but Arthur anticipated this. He had the property independently assessed 3 times in the 5 years before he died, specifically to create a documentation trail that would withstand exactly this kind of challenge. The assessments are in the trust documents. So Arthur knew Harlan would do this. Arthur knew someone like Harlan would do this eventually, Sandra said. He didn't know the name. He knew the type. A pause. The settlement offers $60,000. Yes. Don't take it, she said immediately. Not because of the money, because accepting it would constitute acknowledgement that the auction transfer was potentially defective, which it wasn't, and that acknowledgement would complicate the trust activation. I wasn't going to take it, Luke said. Good. Let me work the response. Give me 48 hours. He handed Carolyn her phone back. She pocketed it and looked at him with the expression of someone running calculations. You're going to need to be visible, she said. Right now, Harlan thinks you're isolated, a lone man with no resources and no local standing. The lawsuit is designed to cost you time and money you don't have and make you feel like the smart play is taking the settlement and walking away. I know, Luke said. So the counter is visibility. You open this shop, you hire people, you build relationships in the community before the lawsuit gets traction. By the time Harlan's arguments reach a judge, you're not a broke biker who stumbled into a property dispute. You're a local employer with community ties and a legitimate operating history. She picked up her largest binder, which means we accelerate the timeline. I'll have the workforce development contact at the college reach out by end of week, and you need to call the Veterans Center today. Today, Luke said. Today, she confirmed. Arthur lost 11 years. Don't lose another day. She left. Luke stood in the middle of the showroom. He thought about the lawsuit. He thought about $60,000 and what it would feel like to walk away from this building and never look back and spend that money on something that actually belonged to him, something without conditions attached. He let himself think about it fully and honestly, the way you have to think about temptation to actually measure it. Then he thought about Journal 9, about Patricia Dunn learning bookkeeping at 62 because a man had sat across a desk from her and told her she was capable of more than her circumstances suggested. He picked up his phone and called the Veterans Center on Reserve Street. The coordinator's name was Jim Hadley, a former Marine with a voice like gravel on a tin roof. Luke explained himself, who he was, what the dealership was, what he was trying to build. He didn't dress it up. He didn't use nonprofit language or program speak. He said, I have a working shop and I'm looking for people who can work with their hands and need a legitimate place to start. I pay fair wages and I'm serious about training. That's it. Jim Hadley was quiet for a moment after Luke finished. You know Arthur Whitmore, he said. I inherited his building, Luke said. Another pause. Arthur sent me 17 people over 20 years. Not one of them let him down. A beat. Or me. Another beat. I got a man right now. Former Army 3 tours, been out 4 years, can't hold employment because of some legal complications from 2 years ago that I won't get into on the phone. He's the best mechanical mind I've seen since I got this job. He just needs someone who's getting to look at his record and see the man instead of the paper. Send him in, Luke said. Just like that. Just like that, Luke said. He heard something shift in Jim Hadley's voice. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. I'll call him today, Hadley said. His name is Roy Dempsey. He'll be there tomorrow morning if I know him. Roy Dempsey showed up at 8 the next morning in clean work clothes with a folded paper in his breast pocket that turned out to be his mechanical certifications and 2 letters of reference from former employers who'd let him go anyway when his background check came back. He was 38, lean and quiet, with the specific stillness of a man who had learned in hard environments to take up only as much space as he needed. He handed Luke the paper without being asked and stood straight while Luke read it. Luke handed it back without having read past the first line. Jim Hadley says you're the best mechanical mind he's seen, Luke said. That's enough for me. Can you start Monday? Roy looked at him for a moment. That's it. You're not going to Bonnie. I'm not going to what? Run the record. No, Luke said. Roy was quiet for a beat. Most people run the record. Most people miss a lot that way, Luke said. He held out his hand. Monday at 7:30. We've got a Sportster to finish running and a lift pit to clear. Roy shook his hand, firmly without excess, the handshake of a man who had been waiting a long time to shake hands with someone who wasn't keeping score before the work started. That was Tuesday. By Friday, things had changed in ways Luke hadn't fully anticipated. A regional business journal, a publication that covered Montana commercial real estate and small business, ran a short item about the Whitmore property transfer. It was factual and brief. A Harley dealership dormant for 11 years had transferred at county auction for $13 due to legal complications, and the new owner had filed to activate a previously sealed charitable trust. The reporter had clearly gotten the trust information from the county clerk's office the same day it became public record. Luke's phone didn't stop for 2 days. Collectors called first. 3 of them in the first 6 hours, all with variations on the same pitch. They were Harley historians. They were preservation specialists. They had buyers who would pay market rate plus provenance, premium, for machines of that era. They wanted to discuss terms. They wanted to arrange viewings. They were very serious. They could move quickly. Luke told each one the same thing politely, and without elaboration, the machines were not for sale. Then reporters called. 2 from Montana outlets, 1 from a regional wire service. They wanted the story, the $13 auction, the sealed trust, the dormant dealership, the ex-Hell's Angel. Luke spoke to all 3 of them and said approximately the same thing to each. The dealership was reopening as a working shop with an employment mission. The trust would fund programs consistent with what Arthur Whitmore had spent 4 decades building, and he wasn't interested in discussing the motorcycle collection. Then Bridges called. Saw the article, Bridges said. I figured you would, Luke said. 3.8 million, Bridges said. The number sat between them on the phone line like an object. The trust, Luke said. Not mine personally. You control it. Subject to conditions, Luke said. Luke, Bridges' voice had changed, not threatening something more complicated than that. Disappointed, maybe, or trying to sound it. You're sitting on a gold mine and you're going to run a charity shop. I'm going to run a mechanic shop, Luke said. That happens to employ people who need a fair shot. That's not charity. That's just how Arthur ran his business. Arthur is dead. His business isn't, Luke said. A long pause. Harlan's going to come at you hard, Bridges said. You know that. I know that. You don't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. Harlan does. I have a good attorney, Luke said, and 11 years of Arthur's preparation. That's not the same as money. No, Luke said. It isn't. He paused. Was there something specific you wanted, Bridges? Or did you call to tell me things I already know? Another pause. Something moved in it, irritation giving way to something else, something harder to categorize. Some of the guys are talking about coming up, Bridges said finally. Want to see the place. Luke understood immediately what that meant and what it didn't mean. Some of the guys was chapter language for organized presence. Want to see the place meant something between curiosity and assertion. The subtext was old and familiar, and Luke knew how to read it the way you know how to read weather. Tell them they're welcome to come as customers, Luke said. Any bike needing service will take it. Any man who wants to learn a trade, I've got room. That's the only offer on the table. Bridges was quiet for a long beat. You've changed, Bridges said. Yeah, Luke said. I have. He hung up. He stood in the service bay with Roy, who had been doing a pre-operational check on the lift equipment and had clearly heard half of that conversation from the way he was carefully not looking at Luke. Former associates, Roy said without looking up from the lift mechanism. Former, Luke confirmed. Roy nodded. He understood former. They going to be a problem? Maybe, Luke said. Not today. Roy went back to the lift check. I've had former associates, he said. The ones who want to watch you fail and the ones who wanted to pull you back, they sound exactly the same on the phone. Luke looked at him. Which kind were those? Roy considered it. Both, he said. I'm still figuring out which is which. Luke almost smiled. Yeah, he said, me too. The lift pit environmental clearance came through Thursday afternoon. Remediation complete. Inspectors signed off, operational clearance granted. Luke called Carolyn. Carolyn called the community college workforce coordinator, a woman named Denise Falk, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of call for 2 semesters and had 3 candidate names ready before Carolyn finished explaining the apprenticeship structure. The first candidate was a 24-year-old named Tyler Moss, fresh out of a recovery program whose counselor had described him in a referral note as the most mechanically intuitive person she'd encountered in 15 years of social work. The second was a woman named Gloria Chen, 41, a single mother of 2 who'd been doing shade tree mechanic work on her own vehicles for a decade and couldn't afford formal training. The third was a man named Frank Okonkwo, 57, who'd been laid off from a manufacturing plant in Butte when it closed and had spent 18 months applying to every mechanical job within driving distance without a single callback. Luke interviewed all 3 in the same afternoon. He used approximately the same approach he'd used with Roy. He listened more than he talked. He asked about the work they'd already done rather than the work they wanted to do, and he did not run background checks. He hired all 3. Roy's expression when Luke told him was complicated surprise, something that looked like relief, and underneath both of those, something that it might have been the early edge of conviction. The expression of a man watching someone behave consistently with what they'd said they were going to do, which is rarer than it should be. 4 of us and you, Roy said. 5 of us? Luke corrected. Roy looked at him. You're getting under the bikes too. I'm not running a shop from an office, Luke said. That's not how I know how to do this. The first week of actual operations was loud and imperfect, and occasionally chaotic in the specific way of any new enterprise where the people involved are competent but haven't yet learned how to work together. Roy and Tyler clashed twice over approach. Tyler's instincts were fast and intuitive. Roy's were methodical and precise, and neither of them was wrong. They were just different, which took them a few days to recognize. Gloria worked quietly and completely and turned out to have a diagnostic instinct for electrical systems that made Luke stop what he was doing the first time he watched her work through a wiring problem and just observe the way you observe something that is genuinely better than you expected. Frank Okonkwo came in the first morning carrying his own tools, a set that must have been 30 years old, every piece worn smooth with use and maintained with the care of someone who understood that tools are not disposable. He set them on the workbench, arranged them in his order, and got to work without preamble. By noon of the first day, Luke had watched him rebuild a carburetor from a 1987 Sportster with the calm precision of a surgeon, every component examined before it was touched, every tolerance checked twice. He was without any contest the most skilled mechanic in the shop. Frank, Luke said that afternoon. Yeah, you applied to every mechanical job in driving distance for 18 months and nobody called you back. Frank looked at him steadily. 57 years old, he said. Black man in western Montana with a manufacturing background and no dealership certification. No, nobody called me back. Luke nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. There was nothing to say about it that Frank didn't already know better than Luke did. What he did was make Frank the lead on the carburetor rebuild project, 4 vintage Harley engines that needed full restoration, and told Roy that Frank's judgment on the restoration work was final. Roy, to his credit, accepted this without argument and spent the afternoon asking Frank questions that revealed he understood immediately what Frank's skill level actually was. The shop had been open 11 days when Victor Harlan walked through the front door. Luke knew who he was before he introduced himself. Not because he'd seen photographs he had from the online search, but they hadn't fully prepared him for the physical reality of Victor Harlan, which was a man in his mid-50s with the build of someone who had once been athletic and was now simply large, wearing a jacket that cost more than Luke's monthly rent had for the last 3 years, moving through the space with the ease of a man accustomed to walking into rooms and having them rearrange around him. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the shop, at Roy at the workbench, at Gloria running diagnostics on a touring bike that had come in the day before at Frank's hands, moving through a disassembled engine with their precise, unhurried authority. He looked at it all for a moment, and Luke could see him recalibrating something. Then he looked at Luke. Mr. Carter, he said, I'm Victor Harlan. I know who you are, Luke said. Harlan nodded, accepting that without visible reaction. I'd like to speak with you privately if you have a few minutes. We can talk here, Luke said. He didn't move. Harlan looked at the employees again briefly, then back at Luke. He accepted the terms without comment, a man who understood when the ground had been set by someone else and chose to work within it rather than contest it. I want to be direct with you, Harlan said. I filed a legal challenge to the auction transfer. You know that. My attorney has contacted yours, but I'm not here about the lawsuit. Then what are you here about? Luke said. I'm here because I've had time to look at the trust documentation now that it's public record, Harlan said. And I want you to understand that I respect what Arthur Whitmore built here. Genuinely. The man spent 40 years doing something remarkable. He paused. Luke waited. But I want you to consider whether you are the right person to carry it forward, Harlan said. Not as an insult, as a practical question. You have no business experience. You have 4 employees in a legal fight on your hands in a trust with conditions that require sustained operational competence over an extended period. 1 bad year, 1 year where the service revenue drops below operating costs and the trust conditions may not be satisfied. And then everything Arthur built disappears anyway. It was well constructed. Luke gave him that. It was designed to sound like concern while functioning as pressure to locate the specific doubt a reasonable man in Luke's position would have about his own adequacy and apply weight to it until the weight became unbearable. Luke had encountered this technique before in rooms with higher stakes. What's your proposal? Luke said. Harlan reached into his jacket, a folded document. He set it on the workbench between them. A partnership structure. Harlan Commercial acquires a 49% operational stake in the dealership. We bring professional management capital and legal resources. The mission continues. I'm willing to put that in writing, the employment programs, the trust conditions, all of it. You retained 51% in operational authority. The lawsuit goes away. And instead of fighting alone on a $13 deed, you have the backing of a company that has been operating successfully in this market for 22 years. Luke looked at the document. He didn't pick it up. He thought about Arthur's journals, about the deliberate legal architecture that had kept men like Harlan away from this building for 11 years, about the specific way Arthur had structured the conditions so that the mission could not be diluted by exactly this kind of incremental acquisition. He thought about 49%. He thought about how 49% in a partnership dispute had a way of becoming 51% when the right pressure was applied at the right moment. He looked at Harlan. No, he said. Harlan's expression didn't change significantly, a small tightening around the eyes. The adjustment of a man who had expected this answer and was now moving to the next position. You don't want to take a moment. No, Luke said again. The lawsuit will be expensive, Harlan said. Not threatening informational, delivering a fact. I imagine it will, Luke said, for both of us. Something shifted in Harlan's expression. Not anger, something cooler. Reassessment. He looked around the shop again at the four people working at the reassembled Sportster in the bay, at the vintage machines along the walls that he had spent 7 years trying to reach. You know what's interesting? Harlan said, his voice dropping, the professional texture becoming something more direct. I've done a lot of deals in this city. I've sat across the table from business owners, developers, city officials, everyone. And I can usually read within the first 5 minutes whether someone's going to be a problem or not. He paused. I didn't read you right. Most people don't, Luke said. Harlan picked up his document from the workbench, folded it, and put it back in his jacket. He nodded once, not concession acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who had encountered something he hadn't fully anticipated and was recalibrating his approach. We'll let the courts sort it out then, he said. We will, Luke said. Harlan walked out. The shop was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Roy had stopped pretending to work on the carburetor in front of him. Gloria had set down her diagnostic tool. Franco Conquo had not stopped working, but his pace had slowed in the way that meant he'd heard every word. That the developer, Roy said. That's him, Luke said. He looked like money, Roy said. He is money, Luke said. That's the whole argument. That's all he's got. Roy looked at the door, then back at Luke. And we've got what exactly saw him. Luke looked around the shop. At Roy with his methodical precision, at Gloria and her electrical instincts, at Frank's hands moving through the engine with 30 years of skill that the market had decided wasn't worth a phone call back. We've got Arthur's preparation, Luke said, and 11 years of it. That night, Sandra called him. The auction documentation is clean, she said. Harlan's notification argument won't survive a motion to dismiss. I'm filing it next week. And the assessed value argument, Arthur's 3 independent assessments create a clear paper trail. The county's opening bid was procedurally consistent with those assessments. Harlan's attorneys know this. They're using the lawsuit for pressure, not because they expect to win it. A pause, which means they're going to look for other angles. What other angles? The trust conditions, she said. If Harlan can demonstrate that the dealership is not operating in good faith compliance with the mission requirements, if he can argue that the programs are inadequate or the employment standards aren't being met, he can petition to have the trust dissolved and the deed transfer voided on the grounds that the transfer was contingent on trust compliance. Luke was quiet for a moment. He'd have to prove we're not running the programs. Correct, Sandra said, which means documentation is critical. Every hire and every referral, every program outcome document, all of it, starting immediately if you haven't already. Carolyn's been doing it since day one, he said. Good. A pause. Luke, there was something else. The shift in her voice was small, but he caught it. What? The regional press coverage triggered something I didn't anticipate, she said. There are 2 collectors who have contacted my office directly, not about buying, about donating. Vintage machines they want to see properly restored and preserved rather than auctioned. One is a 1965 Electra Glide in original paint. The other is a collection of parts for a 1952 Hydroglide that a man in Great Falls has been holding for 20 years waiting for someone to do right by it. Luke was quiet. Arthur's reputation traveled further than his building, Sandra said. People knew what he stood for, even people who never walked through the door. And now that the door is open again, she stopped. Let the sentence finish itself. Luke looked at the wall across from where he sat at the space where he was starting to understand that this was not a small thing he'd stumbled into with $13 in a raised hand. This was not a building. It was not a trust fund. It was not even a motorcycle dealership. It was a network of belief, 40 years of consistent behavior that had convinced people one by one that this was a place where things were done right. And that conviction had survived 11 years of locked doors and legal silence and was now cautiously turning back toward the light like a plant that had been in a dark room for too long and still remembered which direction the sun came from. Tell them yes, Luke said. Both of them. Both of them, he said. Tell them we'll handle the restorations right. Tell them Arthur would have. He would have, Sandra said quietly. After he hung up, Luke sat in the office for a while. Arthur's journals were stacked on the desk. 12 of them. He'd finished reading all 12 the night before sitting in Arthur's chair, with the fluorescent hum overhead, reading until the words started to blur at the edges and he had to stop. He opened the top journal again, not to read, just to hold it, to feel the weight of the composition notebook in his hands. The worn cover, the slightly swelled pages of a book that had been handled many times. 411 names, he'd counted. 411 people spread across 40 years, each one a life that had intersected with this building and been redirected. 411 stories of footholds and second chances and quiet invisible investment. And now Victor Harlan was in a courthouse across town arguing that the building had been improperly transferred. And Bridges was somewhere in Billings calculating what the vintage machines were worth. And two collectors were offering to donate rare motorcycles to a shop that had been open 11 days. And Roy Dempsey was coming in at 7:30 every morning with the specific punctuality of a man who has learned what it costs to be unreliable and has decided he will never pay that cost again. And Gloria Chen was diagnosing electrical faults with an instinct that Luke was increasingly convinced was genuine talent. And Franco Okonkwo was rebuilding carburetors with the patience of someone who had been forced to wait a long time and had used the waiting to get very good at the work. Luke set the journal down. He turned off the office light and walked through the dark showroom, running his hand along a workbench by memory, finding the front door by the pale light leaking under it from the street outside. He locked up. He stood in the parking lot for a moment in the October cold, which had gotten serious in the past week, real cold now, the kind that settled into the ground and didn't leave until April. He thought about a lawsuit being filed in a courthouse 2 miles away. He thought about a dead man's handwriting on an envelope. He thought about 4 people who had showed up at a building on West Broadway with their tools and their histories and their particular skills, and who were right now sleeping in their own beds with the specific quality of sleep that comes from a day of honest work. He got in his truck. He drove home. He did not feel defeated. He did not feel frightened. He felt the particular weight of a man who has accepted something significant, not because it was easy, not because he was certain he could carry it, but because he looked at what needed carrying and understood that he was the one who'd shown up. That was enough. That had always been enough. Sandra's motion to dismiss landed in Missoula County District Court on a Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, Harlan's attorneys had filed their opposition brief, and by Wednesday, the judge had scheduled a preliminary hearing for 3 weeks out. Luke knew all of this because Sandra called him after each development with the precise, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been managing difficult clients through difficult situations for 30 years and had learned that information delivered calmly was information that could be used. What Sandra did not call him about was the deposition notice that arrived at the dealership on Thursday, hand-delivered by a process server who waited until Luke was visible through the window before walking to the door. Luke signed for it and read it standing in the service bay while Roy pretended to focus on the carburetor rebuild and failed completely. Deposition, Roy said when Luke set the document down. Harlan's attorneys want to depose me about the auction, Luke said. Standard tactic. They want to see if I'll say something useful to them. Will you buy him? Luke looked at him. No. Roy nodded. He picked up a wrench. I had a lawyer once who told me depositions were just expensive conversations designed to make you panic. He paused. He was right about the expensive part. Luke called Sandra. She had already received her copy. "Don't worry about it," she said, which was not the same as saying there was nothing to worry about. But he understood the distinction she was drawing. Don't worry about it in a way that changes your behavior, because that's exactly what they want. "They're going to ask about the trust conditions," she said. "Whether the employment programs are genuinely operational or window dressing. I need the documentation Carolyn's been keeping, 3 weeks of records, every hire, every referral source, every hour worked." "I'll have it to you by end of day," Luke said. He called Carolyn. She had the binders ready within the hour. 3 weeks of meticulous records, hire dates, referral sources, daily logs, payroll documentation program, compliance notes organized according to the standards Arthur had specified in the trust appendices. Carolyn handed them to Luke with the expression of a woman who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it accordingly. "He's trying to claim the programs are cosmetic," she said. "I know. 3 weeks of records won't impress a judge on their own," she said. "But 3 weeks of records plus the referral network vouching for the program integrity, that's different. Jim Hadley at the Veterans Center, Denise Falk at the college, the women's shelter on Brooks, which talked to their director last week, and she has 2 candidates ready when you have capacity." She looked at him. "These are real institutional relationships, Luke. Harlan's attorneys are going to have a hard time calling them window dressing when the people running those institutions are willing to say publicly that the program is the real thing." "Have you talked to any of them about that possibility?" "I talked to Jim Hadley," she said. "He used language I won't repeat, but the summary was yes. He's willing to say whatever needs to be said in whatever forum needs it said." Luke almost smiled. "Tell him I appreciate it." The deposition was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the interval, the shop ran. That was the part that didn't make it into any of the court filings or the legal correspondence or the press coverage that was beginning to accumulate around the dealership. Like whether the part where 5 people showed up every morning at 7:30 and did the work. The 2 donated motorcycles arrived the second week, the 1965 Electroglide from a collector in Billings, transported in a climate-controlled trailer, accompanied by a handwritten note from the owner that said, "Only Arthur would have done this right. I trust you will too." The 1952 Hydroglide parts arrived from Great Falls in 4 wooden crates, each component wrapped in cloth and labeled in the careful handwriting of a man who had spent 20 years waiting for the right person to reassemble them. Frank Okonkwo unpacked the Hydroglide components himself, slowly examining each piece with the focused reverence of a man handling something genuinely old and genuinely significant. When he had everything laid out, he stood back and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You know this machine?" Luke asked. "I know this era," Frank said. "My grandfather rode a 51 Panhead. I grew up looking at photographs." He crouched down beside a set of engine cases that had been cleaned but not restored, the original patina intact. "These haven't been apart since the 60s, he said. "Look at the gasket residue. Original seals." He looked up at Luke. "This is going to take 3 months minimum if we do it correctly." "Then it takes 3 months, Luke said. Frank stood up. Something in his posture had shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The specific change that happens in a skilled person when they're given a task genuinely worthy of their skill and told that time and correctness matter more than speed. "Okay," Frank said. He went to get his tools. Tyler Moss, who had been watching the unpacking from a careful distance, came to Luke afterward with a question that cost him something to ask. Luke could see it in the way he set his jaw before he spoke. "Can I help Frank on the Hydroglide?" Tyler said. I know I'm not at his level, but I want to learn that kind of work. The restoration work, if there's room." Luke looked at him. Tyler was 24 and fast and instinctive and had the particular energy of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life moving too quickly and was only now learning that some things required a different pace. His counselor had written in the referral note that Tyler's primary challenge was patience, that he understood mechanical systems intuitively but had a tendency to outrun his own precision. "Ask Frank," Luke said. Tyler looked at him. "You sure?" "Frank decides who works on Frank's project," Luke said. "That's how it works here. Go ask him." The conversation between Tyler and Frank lasted about 4 minutes, conducted quietly at the far end of the service bay, with Luke making no effort to hear it. At the end of those 4 minutes, Frank handed Tyler a parts cleaning brush and pointed at the Hydroglide components. Tyler took the brush and got to work without another word. That was week 3. The deposition happened on a Tuesday in a conference room in Pruitt's office building downtown. Sandra sat beside Luke and Harlan's lead attorney, a woman named Catherine Rice, 50s, precise and relentless, sat across from them and asked questions for 4 hours. She asked about the auction, the $13 Luke's financial situation at the time of bidding, his prior relationship with Arthur Whitmore, his knowledge of the trust before signing the acceptance documents, his qualifications to operate a business, his understanding of the program requirements in Appendix C. Luke answered every question directly without elaboration, without hedging. He had been advised by Sandra to answer exactly what was asked and nothing more, which aligned naturally with how he already communicated. Reese was good. She was looking for the seam, the place where honest uncertainty would expand into something that could be characterized as misrepresentation, or where Luke's lack of business experience could be framed as evidence that the program compliance was not genuine. She asked the employment questions 3 different ways across the 4 hours. Mr. Carter, at the time you hired Roy Dempsey, did you conduct a formal skills assessment? No, Luke said. Did you review his employment history? He showed me his certifications and 2 references. I returned them without reading past the first line. A pause. You hired him without reviewing his qualifications. I hired him based on a referral from Jim Hadley at the Veterans Center, Luke said. Jim Hadley told me Roy Dempsey was the best mechanical mind he'd seen in his career. That was sufficient qualification for me. And if Jim Hadley had been wrong, then I'd have found out in the first week, Luke said. He wasn't wrong. Rice moved on. She tried the same angle with Gloria, with Frank, with Tyler. Each time Luke's answer was essentially the same, and each time it was the truth, which was its own defense. At the end of the deposition, as they were gathering their things, Rice said off the record conversationally, "You're not what I expected, Mr. Carter." Luke looked at her. "What did you expect?" "Someone easier," she said. And the way she said it was not unfriendly, just precise, the way honest people state observable facts. Outside, Sandra walked with him to his truck. "That went as well as it could have gone," she said. Meaning you gave it to nothing," she said, "which is all we needed. The motion to dismiss hearing is in 10 days. I'm feeling better about it than I was a month ago." "What changed?" She looked at him. "The shop," she said simply. "The fact that it's actually running. The fact that those 4 people are actually employed and actually doing the work. Harlan's argument depends on the programs being cosmetic. It's very difficult to make that argument when the programs are visibly, documentably real." She paused. "Arthur planned for the building and the trust. He couldn't plan for the execution. That part is on you, and you've executed." Luke drove back to the shop. He parked and sat in the truck for a moment before going in. He thought about what Sandra had said. He thought about execution, about the specific, unglamorous reality of running a thing rather than planning it. The payroll he'd learned to process, the supplier relationships Carolyn had helped him establish, the scheduling board on the service bay wall where Roy had instituted a system for tracking job status that Luke had adopted without modification because it was better than anything he'd have come up with, the documentation binders, the phone calls to referral coordinators, the daily 7:30 mornings. He thought about Arthur, 40 years of daily 7:30 mornings, building something in the space between intention and practice where real things actually live. He went inside. 2 days later, Bridges showed up. Not just Bridges. 7 men, all in leather, all with patches, pulling into the dealership parking lot in formation and killing their engines with the synchronized authority of people accustomed to arriving places in a way that registers. Luke watched them from the service bay window. He took a breath. He walked to the front door and opened it and stood in it. Bridges led the group in. The other 6 spread slightly behind him, not threateningly but not casually either. They looked at the shop the way the Billings crew had looked at it the first time: inventory assessment. Rapid calculation, the habit of a particular kind of attention. Then Frank Okonkwo looked up from the Hydroglide components where he'd been working, met the eyes of the men filing in, and went back to work without expression. Roy set down his wrench and leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed. Gloria kept her back to the door and kept running diagnostics. Tyler watched from the far bay with the alertness of someone young enough to not yet have learned when to stand down. Bridges, Luke said. Luke! Bridges looked around. His eyes moved from the vintage machines along the walls to the active service bays to the hydroglide laid out on the clean shop floor in organized component groupings. Something moved behind his expression, something more complex than Luke had seen there before. This is real, Bridges said. Not a question. It's real, Luke said. Bridges looked at the man beside him, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Garrett, who Luke had known years earlier by reputation as one of the better wrench hands in the Billings chapter. Garrett was looking at Frank Okonkwo's Hydra Glide components with the focused attention of someone who recognized what they were looking at. Is that a Hydra Glide? Garrett said. He said it the way people say things they expect the answer to be no. 52, Luke said. Frank's doing the restoration. Garrett looked at Frank. Original engine cases. Frank looked up. Original everything, he said. Haven't been apart since '63 as far as I can tell. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Something shifted in him that was visible, even from across the room. He looked at Luke. You need help with that restoration. Luke looked at Garrett. He looked at Bridges. He looked at the 6 men spread across his shop floor, men who had ridden 200 miles to see what was happening here, men whose calculus about this place had been until this moment about value that could be extracted. He looked at Garrett. What did you have in mind? I've got tools in my saddlebag, Garrett said. I've been doing panhead and knucklehead restorations for 20 years. Not for money for the work. He paused. I could come up some weekends, if there's room. The offer hung in the air of the shop for a moment. Luke said, there's room. Bridges was watching all of this with the particular expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation in real time. He turned to Luke. This isn't what I thought it was going to be, he said. What did you think it was going to be? I thought you'd be in over your head, Bridges said, honest direct the way he could be when he dropped the calculation. I thought you'd have lasted 2 weeks before you either caved to Harlan or called someone for help in a different way. I did call people for help, Luke said. Just not the kind you mean. Bridges was quiet. He looked around the shop again at Roy and Gloria and Frank and Tyler, at the documentation binders on the office shelf visible through the window, at the scheduling board on the service bay wall, at the 12 composition journals stacked on the corner of the desk. What are those? Bridges said, nodding toward the journals. Arthur's records, Luke said. What kind of records? People, Luke said. 411 of them over 40 years. Bridges looked at him for a moment. Then he walked to the office doorway, not inside, just to the threshold, and looked at the journals. He stood there long enough that it stopped being casual. He kept a record of everyone he helped, Bridges said. He kept a record of everyone he invested in, Luke said. There's a difference in his words. Bridges turned back. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was processing something he didn't have immediate language for. He looked at Garrett, who was now crouched next to the hydroglide components, with Frank, both of them examining a set of engine cases with the shared absorption of 2 men who have found each other through a subject they both care about deeply. Some of the guys have been talking, Bridges said, his voice lower now. Not about the machines, about this, what you're building here. Luke waited. There are men in the chapter, older guys who are getting to the point where the road isn't the point anymore, who know how to do this work. He gestured at the service bays. Restoration work, fabrication, mechanical training. Skills that don't get passed down because there's nowhere to pass them to. He looked at Luke directly. Arthur's place used to be that somewhere before it closed. Luke held the weight of what Bridges was saying. He held it carefully because it was heavier than it sounded. What Bridges was describing, circling it without quite landing on it, was the possibility of men who had spent their lives in a certain kind of community finding a way to contribute something genuine to a different kind of community. Not redemption, Luke didn't think in those terms, and he didn't think Bridges did either. Something more practical. Skill transfer. Knowledge that existed and would otherwise be lost. Any man who wants to volunteer his skills here, Luke said, is welcome on the same terms as everyone else. The work is the standard, nothing else. Bridges nodded slowly. The patches don't matter inside. The patches don't matter inside, Luke said. Bridges looked around the shop one more time. All right, he said. 3 of the 7 men stayed that afternoon. Garrett stayed with the hydroglide. 2 others, a man named Steck, who turned out to have spent 12 years as an automotive electrician, and an older man called Mace, who did not offer his real name and whose hands revealed a lifetime of fabrication work, found their way into the service bays and began helping without being asked and did not stop until 4:30. When they left, Roy came to Luke in the office. "That was unexpected," Roy said. "Yeah," Luke said. "Good unexpected or good," Luke said, "as long as the work stays the standard." "Frank didn't look up from the hydroglide the entire time Garrett was there," Roy said. "I've never seen Frank not look up for anyone." "That's because Garrett knew what he was looking at," Luke said. Roy was quiet for a moment. "You think they'll come back?" "Garrett will," Luke said. "The others I don't know, but they saw what this is. That matters more than whether they come back, because they'll talk." He was right about that. Within 2 weeks, 3 more men from the Billings chapter had driven up on separate weekends to help with the restoration work, all of them with specific skills, all of them finding their way into the shop's rhythm with the natural ease of people doing work they already know how to do. The dynamic in the shop shifted in ways Luke hadn't anticipated. The mixing of Roy's methodical Army discipline with the older biker's decades of practical knowledge produced unexpectedly a teaching environment. Tyler Moss absorbed everything within earshot and range of vision with the specific hunger of someone who has finally found the right room. The motion to dismiss hearing happened on a gray Thursday morning in November. Luke sat behind Sandra at the respondents' table and watched Catherine Rice present Harlan's arguments with precision and controlled force. Sandra responded with the auction documentation, Arthur's 3 independent assessments, the trust structure, and 3 weeks of operational program records. She also submitted signed statements from Jim Hadley at the Veterans Senate, Denise Falk at the Community College, and the director of the Women's Shelter on Brooks, each one attesting to the legitimacy and good faith of the dealership's employment programs. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Calloway with reading glasses on a chain, and the manner of someone who had seen every variation of commercial property dispute Missoula County could produce, read the briefs, listened to the arguments, asked 3 questions of each side, and took the matter under advisement. She issued her ruling 6 days later. Sandra called Luke at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday. She dismissed the notification argument entirely, Sandra said. The assessed value argument she found insufficient to meet the burden for voiding the transfer. She let the easement claim survive, but only the easement and the easement alone cannot void the deed transfer. It can only affect the eastern boundary use. A pause. The lawsuit is effectively over Luke. Harlan can appeal the easement ruling, but his attorneys know a boundary dispute doesn't get him the building. The core challenge failed. Luke was standing in the service bay when he took the call. Roy was on the other side of the lift doing a brake check on a touring bike that had come in the day before. Gloria was at her workbench. Frank was at the hydroglide, which was now in its 6th week and beginning to look like a motorcycle again, rather than a component inventory. He lowered the phone. "Sandra says the lawsuit's done," he said. Roy straightened up from behind the touring bike. He looked at Luke. Then he looked at Frank, who had set down his tools. Then at Gloria, who had turned from her workbench. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything theatrical. What happened was quieter than that, a quality of stillness that moved through the shop like a change in air pressure, the specific stillness of people who have been holding something tense for weeks and are now carefully setting it down. Frank Okonkwo picked up his tools and went back to the hydroglide. Tyler, who had arrived 3 minutes earlier and caught the last part, stood in the service bay doorway looking at Luke. "What does that mean for us?" he said. "It means the building is ours," Luke said, "which it always was. Now the court agrees." Tyler nodded. He absorbed that. Then he went to join Frank at the hydroglide. Luke called Sandra back. "What does Harlan do now?" "He sulks," Sandra said. "And then he moves on to the next property. Men like Harlan always have a next property. A beat. There's something else." The judge's ruling included a note. It's unusual, judges don't typically editorialize in dismissal orders, but she commented on the trust structure. She called it one of the most deliberately constructed philanthropic instruments she had encountered in her time on the bench. Sandra paused. "I think she wanted it on record that she understood what Arthur built." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Thank Arthur," he said. "I think you're the one who made it worth protecting," Sandra said. He went back to work. The weeks after the ruling had a different quality from the weeks before. It not easier exactly because the operational challenges didn't diminish with the removal of the legal threat, but lighter. The weight of the lawsuit had been sitting on the shop the way actual weight sits pressing on everything and everyone in it. Without that weight, the work itself became more visible, and the work was good. Frank's Hydroglide restoration was drawing attention in circles Luke hadn't anticipated. A journalist who wrote about vintage motorcycle restoration for a specialty publication had heard about the project through the collector who donated the parts and had driven to Missoula to see it. He spent 4 hours in the shop, mostly watching Frank work, asking technical questions that Frank answered in full and with precision. The piece he eventually published described the Whitmore dealership's restoration work as the finest example of period-correct Harley restoration practice he had encountered in 20 years of covering the subject. The piece ran in January. By February, Luke had more restoration inquiries than the shop could handle. He hired 2 more people. The first was a woman named Diane Reeves, no relation to Dale from Journal 1, who came through a referral from the women's shelter on Brooks. She was 36, had 2 kids, had never worked on a motorcycle in her life, but had spent 8 years as a precision machinist before her marriage ended and her circumstances collapsed. Within 3 weeks of starting at the shop, she was doing fabrication work that made Garrett stop what he was doing and watch when he was there on weekends. The second hire was a young man named Isaiah, 19 years old, referred by a high school teacher who had written in his referral note that Isaiah was either going to do something extraordinary or disappear into circumstances that didn't deserve him, and that she was asking Luke to make sure it was the former. Isaiah had never held a formal job. He showed up the first day an hour early and cleaned the shop floor without being asked, and then stood waiting to be told what to do with the patient readiness of someone who had decided consciously and completely to be serious about this. Luke put him with Roy. Within 2 months, Roy had stopped calling Isaiah the new kid. Within 3, he was calling him by name and asking his opinion on diagnostic approaches, which was Roy's highest form of professional respect, and everyone in the shop knew it. The referral network was expanding on its own. Now, not because Luke was pushing it, but because the people it had produced were producing results that the institutions in that network could see and measure. Jim Hadley sent 3 more veterans. Denise Falk added the dealership to the community college's official employer partnership list. The women's shelter director stopped by in person one afternoon and spent an hour in the shop and left saying she wished she'd known Arthur Whitmore, which was the most accurate summary of the situation Luke had heard. Carolyn came in 3 days a week and managed the documentation and the trust disbursements and the increasingly complex operational records with the organized intensity of someone who had been waiting her whole professional life to apply her skills to something she actually believed in. She and Frank had developed an unlikely alliance based on mutual precision. She called it the Binder and Torque Wrench Coalition, which made Frank produce a sound that was close enough to a laugh that everyone acknowledged it as one. One evening in early March, Luke was finishing up in the office when Sandra called again. He answered expecting administrative follow-up. There was always administrative follow-up. "I had lunch with a colleague today," Sandra said. "Family court attorney. She mentioned a situation, a woman and her teenage son. The son has been in and out of trouble. The family is stable now, but he's at the age where the next 18 months are going to determine a lot. He's mechanically gifted, apparently. Dismantled and reassembled his mother's washing machine at 14 to fix it, successfully." Luke was quiet for a moment. He thought about Isaiah, about the referral note from the teacher who had wanted to make sure someone made a choice for the right outcome. He thought about Marcus Webb in Journal 8, the man Arthur had given a floor sweep job to because he'd looked at someone who had survived their worst moment and seen someone worth investing in. "Tell her to have the mother call me," Luke said. "Just like that," Sandra said. The echo of Jim Hadley's voice on the phone, the first call, Roy Dempsey, the Veterans Center. Just like that," Luke said. After he hung up, he sat in the office in the quiet of the closed shop. He could hear the March wind outside, still cold Montana, holding on to winter with the stubbornness that defined the season. He looked at the journals stacked on the corner of the desk. He looked at Carolyn's documentation binders on the shelf beside them. He looked at the scheduling board on the service bay wall, visible through the office window, the grid of current projects assigned technicians, target completion dates written in Roy's careful block printing. The board was full. Every bay had work. Every technician had assignment. The trust's disbursements were covering the program costs exactly as Arthur's financial projections had anticipated. because Arthur had spent 40 years learning the precise relationship between service revenue and program capacity and had calibrated his trust accordingly. The operational machine Arthur had built was running. Not perfectly, there were days of friction and miscommunication and equipment problems, and the 100 small failures that constitute the daily reality of any working enterprise. But running, consistently, purposefully in the direction of the thing it had been built to do. Luke opened the bottom desk drawer. He had put something there 2 weeks earlier after the lawsuit was dismissed, intending to do something with it when the right moment arrived. He took it out now. It was a blank composition notebook, black marbled cover, the kind Arthur had used for his journals. He set it on the desk in front of him. He opened it to the first page. He looked at the blank space for a long time. Then he picked up a pen. At the top of the page, he wrote a name. Below it, the date. Below that, he began to write, not about motorcycles, not about the dealership, not about legal proceedings or trust conditions or restoration specifications. He wrote about a man named Roy Dempsey who had shown up with folded certifications in his breast pocket and stood straight while Luke decided in 30 seconds that the certifications didn't matter. He wrote about what Roy had become in 6 months, the methodical precision that the shop had been built around the way he'd taken Isaiah under his instruction, with the seriousness of someone who understood that teaching was its own form of investment. He turned the page. He wrote about Gloria Chen and electrical systems and the particular quality of watching someone discover that what they'd been doing in their backyard for years was actually a genuine professional skill. He turned the page again. He wrote about Frank Okonkwo and a set of 1952 engine cases that hadn't been apart since 1963, and about what it looked like when a man was given work that was genuinely worthy of him. He wrote about Tyler and the brush Frank had handed him and what patience looked like when it was being learned in real time. He wrote about Diane and Isaiah and the teacher's referral note. He wrote for 2 hours. When he stopped, he had filled 11 pages, and he had not described a single motorcycle. He closed the notebook. He set it beside Arthur's journals. It was smaller, thinner, the beginning of something rather than the record of something complete. But it was there, a real object occupying real space, the first page of an accounting that would take years to fill and would ultimately be about the same thing Arthur's 12 notebooks had been about. People. The specific, unglamorous compounding reality of what happens when someone with resources, not necessarily money, just will, and space and consistency decides to invest those resources in the people around them and then gets out of the way. Luke turned off the office light. He walked through the dark showroom, familiar now. The workbenches and the machines navigated by memory. He unlocked the front door and stepped out into the March cold. He stood in the parking lot. The sign overhead, Whitmore Harley Davidson, on still faded, still moving slightly in the wind on its original brackets, was visible against the sky. Luke looked at it for a moment. He had thought in the first days that he should change the sign, put his own name on it or something more descriptive of what the place had become. He had not changed it. He understood now why he hadn't, in a way that had taken months to fully articulate to himself. The name on the sign was not about ownership. It was about continuity. Arthur Whitmore had built something that outlasted him by 11 years of locked-door darkness and was still running. The name on the building was a promise to every person who walked through the door, looking for a foothold, to every referral coordinator who sent someone there in good faith, to every man who drove 200 miles on a weekend to help with a restoration because they understood that the work was worth doing. The promise was, this place is what it says it is. It has been this before you arrived. It will be this after you leave. You can count on it. Luke looked at the sign for another moment. Then he got in his truck and drove home through the March dark, past the lights of Missoula, going about its evening, past the restaurant below his room, past everything that had been ordinary before October, and that was now arranged differently around a center that had changed. He parked. He sat in the truck for a moment. He thought about tomorrow. Roy at 7:30, Isaiah at 7:30. Frank with his tools arranged in his order, the Hydroglide now fully assembled, running its engine, turning over with the deep, specific voice of a machine built 60-some years ago by people who understood that what they were making had to last. He thought about the boy Sandra's colleague had mentioned, the 19 months, the washing machine at 14. He thought about a blank page with a name at the top. He got out of the truck. He went inside. He slept the way he'd been sleeping since October, without the weight that had lived in his chest for years before this. Clean sleep. The sleep of a man who knows when he wakes up where he's going. The boy's name was Caleb Marsh. Not related to Carolyn, and Luke had checked, mildly curious about the coincidence. Caleb was 17, the son of a woman named Patricia, who had spent the last 3 years rebuilding a life after a custody dispute that had taken everything except the two things that mattered, which were her son and her decision to stop making choices that cost her either. Sandra's colleague had made the call, Patricia had made the appointment, and Caleb had shown up on a Tuesday afternoon in March with his hands in his jacket pockets and the specific expression of a teenager who has been brought somewhere by an adult's decision and is reserving judgment. Luke came out from the service bay and looked at him. Caleb was lean, maybe 5'10", with the unfinished quality of someone still growing into his own height. He had grease under 2 fingernails that he hadn't been able to completely clean, which Luke noticed immediately and said nothing about. "Your mom's inside talking to Carolyn," Luke said. "I know," Caleb said. "You want to see the shop?" A beat, the reservation giving slightly. "Sure," Caleb said. Luke walked him through. He didn't narrate. He didn't explain programs or mission or trust conditions. He just walked him through the way you walk someone through a place you work in. "This is Roy. He's doing brake lines on the touring bike. This is Isaiah. He's running the diagnostic on the carburetor issue that came in yesterday. This is Frank. Don't interrupt Frank when he's in the middle of something that's a standing rule." They stopped at the Hydroglide. The restoration was complete. Frank had finished it 10 days earlier, and it sat now under the shop lights with the particular authority of a machine that has been returned to exactly what it was built to be, not better than original, not modified, just precisely and completely itself again. The engine had been test run for the first time in over 60 years, turning over with a sound that had made Frank stand very still, with his eyes closed for a full 30 seconds afterward, which was the closest Luke had seen the man come to visible emotion. Caleb stopped walking when he saw it. He didn't say anything. He looked at it the way people look at things that exceed their expectation before they have had time to form a response. 52 Hydroglide, Luke said. Frank spent 4 months on the restoration. "That's real paint," Caleb said. "Original," Luke said. "Every panel." Caleb crouched down beside it without asking permission, which was the right instinct. You don't ask permission to look closely at something mechanical, you just look. He examined the engine cases, the tank, the primary cover. He was reading the machine the way someone reads a machine when they actually understand what they're looking at. "My mom's washing machine has a different kind of primary seal," he said, not looking up. "The drum bearing. I had to fabricate a replacement because the manufacturer discontinued the part." Luke looked at him. "How?" "I used a piece of pipe from a plumbing supply and machined it down with a drill press and a file," Caleb said. "Took me 3 days to get the tolerance right." He looked up. It held. Luke was quiet for a moment. He thought about Arthur and Marcus Webb in Journal 8. He thought about looking at someone standing in a parking lot and seeing past the surface version of the story to the one underneath. "You want to come in Saturdays," Luke said. Caleb stood up. He looked at Luke directly for the first time since they'd met. "What would I do? Whatever Frank needs," Luke said. "Floor sweep at first, then whatever you show us you can handle." Caleb looked at the Hydroglide, then back at Luke. "Okay," he said. Patricia was in the office with Carolyn when they came back, and the way she looked at her son's face when he walked in the reading, she did in the 2 seconds before Caleb said anything, told Luke everything he needed to know about what the last 3 years had cost her and what this conversation meant. "Saturday," Caleb told his mother. Patricia looked at Luke over her son's shoulder. She didn't say thank you. The moment was too large for that specific phrase. She just looked at him with the direct, clear expression of someone who understands that something real has just happened and doesn't want to diminish it with inadequate language. Luke nodded. She nodded back. That was March. By June, the shop had 11 employees. Not all full-time. The program structure allowed for part-time and apprenticeship arrangements that Arthur had specified in Appendix C as a way of lowering the barrier to entry for people whose circumstances made full-time commitment initially impossible. But 11 people who came to 4814 West Broadway regularly, who knew the scheduling board by heart, who understood Frank's rule about interruptions and Roy's diagnostic methodology, in the specific language Gloria used when she was about to solve an electrical problem, which involved a long exhale followed by silence, followed by the solution stated as a flat declarative fact. Caleb came every Saturday and stayed until the shop closed. Within 6 weeks, Frank had moved him off floor sweep and onto parts cleaning for the ongoing restoration projects, which in the Whitmore shop taxonomy meant Frank had decided Caleb's hands could be trusted near irreplaceable components. This was not a small promotion. Roy witnessed the transition and mentioned it to Luke with the specific tone Roy used for things he considered significant but didn't want to overstate. Frank let him touch the Electroglide parts, Roy said. I saw, Luke said. Frank doesn't let anyone touch the Electroglide parts. He let you touch them last month, Luke said. Roy was quiet for a beat. That's my point, he said. The 1965 Electroglide restoration had begun in April, after Frank finished the Hydroglide and took 3 days off the only 3 consecutive days he'd missed since starting, and came back visibly ready for the next project. The Electroglide was a different kind of challenge from the Hydroglide. Where the Hydroglide had been complete but long dormant, the Electroglide had been partially disassembled by a previous owner with good intentions and insufficient skill, which meant components had been separated from their original positions, some hardware had been replaced with incorrect substitutes, and the documentation of original configuration was incomplete. Frank spent 4 days just doing assessment before touching anything. He sat with photographs, with parts manuals, with a magnifying glass and a notepad reconstructing the machine's history from physical evidence, the way a detective reconstructs an event from what it left behind. Caleb sat with him for 2 of those 4 days, asked questions when Frank's body language indicated questions were acceptable, and was silent when it didn't. Luke watched this dynamic develop from the office and understood it for what it was. Frank was teaching, not in a structured, program-compliant way, in the way that actual knowledge transfer happens, which is osmotic and situational, and requires a learner willing to absorb and a teacher willing to be observed. Caleb was absorbing at a rate that made Luke think about the teacher's referral note, the 19 months, the washing machine. In May, a woman named Charisse Walker came in through a referral from the women's shelter, 43 years old, quiet with the contained posture of someone who has spent years making herself smaller to avoid friction. Her paperwork showed a background in administrative work and 10 years out of the formal workforce. Carolyn hired her immediately for the office administration role that Carolyn herself had been filling in addition to her consulting work, which had been producing a document backlog that even Carolyn's organizational intensity couldn't fully manage. Within 3 weeks, Charisse had restructured the filing system, created a client intake process that reduced the administrative time per new referral by 40%, and identified 3 billing errors in the service department that had been costing the shop money for months. Carolyn came to Luke after the 3rd week and said with the precision of someone making an important distinction, I want to be clear that I did not hire her because she needed a chance. I hired her because she was the most qualified person who walked through that door. The fact that her circumstances meant she needed someone to look past a gap in her resume is a separate issue. I know, Luke said. I'm making the distinction, Carolyn said, because it matters. Arthur understood it. The program works because the work is real and the standards are real, and the people aren't hired to fill a category. They're hired because they're capable. The circumstances just explain why they needed the door opened. Arthur wrote something like that in Journal 3, Luke said. I know, Carolyn said. He told me the same thing in person 23 years ago. She paused. He also told me I talked too much about things I already believed and should spend more time acting on them. She picked up her binder. I'm still working on that. June brought a development that Luke hadn't anticipated. A filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, a woman named Reese Alderman, who had produced 2 well-regarded pieces about American craftsmanship and working-class communities, contacted the shop after seeing the specialty publication piece about Frank's Hydroglide restoration. She wanted to make a short documentary about the dealership, not about the legal fight, not about the $13 auction, not about the Hells Angels angle that every press inquiry had led with since the regional business journal piece. She wanted to document the restoration work and the employment programs as a single unified subject. She called, Luke directly explained herself in under 2 minutes and said, I'm not interested in the dramatic backstory. I'm interested in what's actually happening in that building. Luke was quiet for a moment. He thought about Arthur's journals, about 411 names and 40 years of work that had been invisible by design invisible, because Arthur had understood that the moment the work became about the story of the work rather than the work itself, something essential was lost. I need to think about it, Luke said. Of course, she said. He thought about it for a week. He talked to Carolyn, who said it depended entirely on whether the filmmaker could be trusted to tell the right story. He talked to Roy, who said the shop's reputation was already traveling on its own, and he didn't see what a documentary added. He talked to Frank, who said almost nothing for a long moment, and then said, if she can show the work the way the work actually is, not glamorized, not simplified, then yes. If she's going to make it pretty, no. Luke called Reese Alderman back. One condition, he said, name it. The employees decide individually whether they appear on camera, he said. No pressure, no program framing, no recovery narratives unless someone chooses to tell their own story in their own words. The work is the subject. The people are the people, not the program. A brief pause. That's exactly how I wanted to do it, she said. Then yes, Luke said. Reese spent 3 weeks in the shop in July. She brought a small crew, a camera operator, and a sound person, and they moved through the space with a quietness that Luke respected immediately. She did not conduct formal interviews in the first week. She watched. She sat in the office and read Arthur's journals with Luke's permission and said nothing for 2 days afterward. On the third day, she came to Luke and said, he was extraordinary. He was consistent, Luke said, for 40 years. That's what it looked like from the outside. She filmed Frank and Caleb working on the Electra Glide for an entire day without interruption. She filmed Roy and Isaiah running diagnostics on a touring bike that belonged to a retired school teacher from Lolo, who had driven it for 30 years and wanted it maintained properly. She filmed Gloria tracing an electrical fault through a wiring harness with the focused calm of someone who has done something so many times that the doing has become a form of rest. Gloria, who had not spoken on camera the first 2 weeks, came to Luke in the third week and said she wanted to say something if that was still an option. It's always an option, Luke said. She sat down with Reese that afternoon and talked for 40 minutes. Luke didn't hear the content. It was private, conducted in the office with the door closed. But when Gloria came out, her face had the particular quality of someone who has set something down that they had been carrying for a long time and discovered that the setting down, rather than leaving an absence, created a kind of lightness they hadn't expected. Reese's crew finished in late July. She shook Luke's hand at the door on the last day. This place is going to outlast all of us, she said. That's the point, Luke said. August brought a milestone that Carolyn marked with the specific satisfaction of someone whose primary relationship with time was organizational. The Trust's first full annual disbursement cycle was complete, and the operational accounts showed that the service revenue had covered 63% of operating costs, with the Trust covering the remaining 37%, which was exactly the ratio Arthur had projected in the financial guidelines he'd left in the manila envelopes in the safe. 63% service coverage in year one with 11 employees and a full restoration program and administrative infrastructure built from nothing. Carolyn presented the numbers to Luke with a single sentence. Arthur's projections were right. Arthur's projections were based on 40 years of doing this, Luke said. Yes, she said, which is why they were right. He filed the annual trust compliance report with Sandra's office. Sandra reviewed it and called him the same day. The trust board is going to want to meet with you, she said. Arthur established a 3-person oversight board for the trust. They've been dormant since his death, but the first year of compliance reporting activates their oversight function. A pause. I should tell you that one of the board members is Marcus Webb. Luke was still for a moment. Journal 8. Former corrections. 3 years served. Floor sweep job. Shop keys in 6 months. His own shop in Kalispell. Birthday calls every year. He knows about me, Aoi, Luke said. He knew about you before you bought the building, Sandra said. Arthur told him years ago that he'd identified a successor. He didn't give your name, just told Marcus to watch the property. Marcus has been watching the county filings on that building for 11 years. Luke processed this. He's been waiting. He's been hoping, Sandra said. There's a difference. The trust board meeting is in September, held at Sandra's office on a Thursday morning. Marcus Webb was 52, a broad man with close-cropped gray hair and the specific physical presence of someone who has spent decades doing physical work and has the build to show it. He ran a 12-person motorcycle repair shop in Kalispell and had, according to Sandra's briefing, quietly replicated several elements of Arthur's employment philosophy in his own operation. He shook Luke's hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary, in a way that communicated something he didn't put into words yet. The meeting was formal for the first 20 minutes. The two other board members, both attorneys who had known Arthur professionally, reviewed the compliance report and asked procedural questions that Luke answered with the documentation Carolyn had prepared. Then the attorney stepped out to confer, and Marcus Webb looked at Luke across the table. "Arthur told me about Route 200, Marcus said. "I figured," Luke said. "He told me the day he wrote you into the plan," Marcus said. "That was 9 years ago. He called me and told me he'd found the right person and he was going to start arranging the transfer structure." He paused. "I asked him why he was so certain about someone he'd met once on a highway for 40 minutes. "What did he say?" Luke said. Marcus looked at him steadily. "He said the length of the meeting wasn't the point. He said you could see a person's character in a single decision if you knew what you were looking at. And stopping for a stranger and refusing payment and saying you needed help, that's enough. He said that told him everything about how you made decisions when nobody was watching and nothing was at stake for you personally." Luke held that. He'd lived with Arthur's letter for almost a year now. He'd read it so many times that its language had become part of his own internal monologue. But hearing it reflected back through Marcus, through the chain of people, Arthur's decision had touched hearing it as the thing it had actually been, which was not a sentimental gesture but a serious and considered judgment by a man who had spent 40 years reading people landed differently. "He was more right than he knew," Marcus said quietly. "I've been watching the filings on that building for 11 years, hoping the right person would show up. I'd been waiting long enough that I'd started to wonder if the right person existed." He paused. "And then a broke ex-Hell's Angel paid $13 for a condemned property that nobody else would touch." The two attorneys came back in. The board voted unanimously to confirm the compliance report and authorize the second year's trust disbursements. After the meeting, Marcus walked out with Luke. "I want to bring some of my people down," Marcus said. "Not for the restoration projects, for the program structure. I've been running informal employment programs in Kalispell for 8 years, and I've never had the documentation framework right. Carolyn's system is better than anything I've built. Come down whenever," Luke said. "Bring whoever needs to see it." Marcus looked at him. "You know what you're doing now is what Arthur did," he said. "You're not just running programs. You are building the network, the referral relationships, the institutional connections, the inter-shop knowledge transfer." He paused. Arthur had 17 shops and organizations he was connected to before he died. You've got the college, the Veterans Center, the shelter. Give it 5 years. Luke thought about that on the drive back to the shop. He thought about Arthur's journals, the expansion years in Journal 8, the decade when the network had grown past direct employment into something larger and more self-sustaining. He thought about what Marcus had just described, not a single shop running programs, but a web of shops and organizations sharing methodology and referral capacity and institutional knowledge, each one reinforcing the others. He thought about Arthur at 40 years and still filling composition notebooks with names. He thought about his own notebook on the corner of the desk, 7 months old, 60 pages filled. He was back at the shop by noon. Caleb was in the service bay with Frank, both of them focused on the Electroglide's primary chain tensioner, which had turned out to be a fabrication challenge that was consuming a week of Frank's measured attention. Caleb was holding a flashlight at the precise angle Frank required, and not moving and not talking, which was the highest form of assistance Frank accepted from anyone. Roy was at the scheduling board, updating job status. Isaiah was under a touring bike running an oil system diagnostic. Charisse was in the office, phone to her ear, handling a service inquiry with the quiet competence she brought to everything. Gloria was at her workbench, and as Luke walked past, she said without looking up, "Electrical fault on the 68 shovelhead that came in Monday is a ground wire corrosion issue behind the primary. I'll have it done by 3. "Good," Luke said and kept walking. He stopped in the office doorway. Charisse was finishing her call, writing an appointment in the schedule book in her careful, precise hand. She hung up. "New service client," she said. "Woman in Lolo, her husband's bike, he passed away 6 months ago, and she wants it maintained so her son can eventually ride it." She paused. "I told her we'd be honored." Luke nodded. That was the right thing to say. He went to his desk and opened the notebook. He wrote about September, about Marcus Webb's handshake and the trust board, and the thing Arthur had said 9 years ago about a single decision and what it revealed. He wrote about the Electroglide and Caleb holding a flashlight at the required angle for however long Frank needed it held. He wrote about Charisse and the woman in Lolo, and the husband's bike, and the son who would eventually ride it. He was writing when Carolyn came in at 2 o'clock. She looked at the notebook and said nothing for a moment. She had seen it before he wrote in it most evenings, but something in her expression today was different, something careful. "How many pages?" she said. 70-something, he said. She was quiet. She sat down across from him. "Luke," she said, "I want to tell you something that Arthur told me once. He told me late. I'd been connected to his network for almost 15 years when he told me this, so you'd think he'd have said it earlier, but Arthur was deliberate about timing." Luke set down the pen. "He told me that the hardest part of what he was doing was never the money or the programs or the legal structure," she said. "He said the hardest part was accepting that the majority of the work would be invisible to him, that most of the people he helped would go on and build things he would never see and help people he would never meet, and the ripple would travel past his range of vision and keep going." She looked at him steadily. He said the only way to make peace with that was to decide that the traveling was the point, not the witnessing. Luke was quiet. "I'm telling you that," she said, "because I watch you write in that notebook every evening, and I want to make sure you understand that what you're recording is not the full accounting. The full accounting is not recordable. It's too large. It's already too large." She got up and went to the filing cabinet and started the day's documentation. Luke looked at the open notebook. He thought about 411 names in 12 composition notebooks, and the understanding that even Arthur's meticulous record was incomplete, that for every name Arthur had written down, there were 2 or 3 or 10 people downstream who had been affected by that person's stabilization and whom Arthur had never known. He thought about what it meant to put a name at the top of a page and write the beginning of a story whose middle and end you would never see. He thought about that for a while. Then he closed the notebook and went back to work. October came. 1 year. Luke opened the shop on the 14th, the anniversary of the auction, the same way he opened it every morning. He unlocked the front door with the brass key, switched on the fluorescent lights, put the coffee on in the back. Roy arrived at 7:27. Isaiah at 7:29. Frank at 7:30, exactly carrying his tools in the same battered case he'd carried on the first day, setting them on the workbench in his order. Carolyn arrived at 8 with a folder of documents. The annual compliance report finalized. 11 employees, 4 active restoration projects. Referral relationships with 7 institutions. Trust disbursements fully compliant. Service revenue at 68% of operating increase, 5 points higher than year 1. She set the folder on his desk without ceremony. "Year 2, she said. "Year 2, he said. He signed the compliance documents and called Sandra. She received them and confirmed filing within the hour. That afternoon, a man walked into the shop Luke had never seen before. Mid-40s, road-worn, a traveling man's ease with unfamiliar spaces. He had a 2003 Road King with a transmission issue and had seen the Whitmore name on a forum discussion about quality Harley service in Montana. Luke came out from the bay to talk to him. "Good shop," the man said, looking around. "Good shop," Luke said. "That's a Hydroglide," the man said, stopping. 52, Luke said. "Restoration complete." The man crouched beside it exactly the way Caleb had the first time reading it, not performing. He looked at it for a long moment. "Who did the work?" he said. "Frank Okonkwo," Luke said. "He's in the service bay." The man stood up. Something in his face had shifted genuine respect, the kind that doesn't require expression because it doesn't have anywhere else to go. "I'd like to shake his hand," he said. Luke walked him back. Frank was at the Electroglide, deep in the primary assembly hands, moving with their careful, deliberate authority. Luke caught his eye. Frank straightened. "Man out front wants to shake your hand," Luke said. He saw the Hydroglide. Frank wiped his hands on his shop rag. He came around the bike. He shook the man's hand. The man said, "Finest restoration work I've seen in 20 years of riding." Frank looked at him for a moment and then nodded once, the nod of someone receiving a statement they know to be true and accepting it without false modesty. The man left his Road King for the transmission repair and rode away with a loaner Luke had set up through a relationship with a dealer 2 blocks over. He came back 3 days later, paid the invoice, and asked, before he left, whether the shop did apprenticeships. Luke looked at him. You asking for yourself or for someone? My nephew, the man said. 18, good hands, bad circumstances. Have him call, Luke said. He wrote the shop number on the back of a business card. The man took it. He looked at Luke for a moment with the specific look of someone trying to understand what they're encountering. What kind of shop is this exactly? Luke thought about how to answer that. He thought about Arthur's letter, about the journals, about the $13 and the brass key and the composition notebooks and the network of invisible kindness that had been running for 40 years before he'd walk through a front door he had no particular reason to walk through. It's a working shop, Luke said. We fix motorcycles, we do restoration work, and we hire people who are good at this and need someone to not hold their past against them. The man nodded slowly. Arthur Whitmore's place, he said. I've heard about this place. You have, Luke said. He's gone. 11 years, Luke said. The man looked around the shop one more time, at Caleb and Frank at the Electroglide, at Roy at the scheduling board, at Isaiah running diagnostics, at Charisse visible through the office window, at Gloria at her workbench doing what she always did, which was solve the problem in front of her, with the efficient intensity of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything. Doesn't look like it, the man said. He walked out. Luke stood in the service bay after he left and held those words for a moment. Doesn't look like it. He thought about what Reese the filmmaker had said, this place is going to outlast all of us. He thought about Carolyn and the traveling and the ripple passing beyond the range of vision. November. The documentary aired on a streaming platform that specialized in American craft and working-class subjects. Luke watched it once alone in the office after the shop closed on his laptop with the volume low. It was 47 minutes. It opened with Frank's hands and the Hydroglide. It closed with Gloria's voice from that afternoon with the door closed, that Luke had not heard saying something that Luke had not known she'd said, which was this: I came in here thinking I was going to get a chance. What I got was a job. There's a difference. One means someone's doing you a favor. The other means someone looked at what you can actually do and made a decision based on that. I've been doing this work for years. I just needed someone to look. Luke sat in the office after the documentary ended and looked at the wall. He thought about Arthur's letter, about 5 words on a Montana highway, about $13 and a brass key and 12 composition notebooks in the specific kind of compounding that happens when one person with will and space and consistency invests those things in the people around them and then gets out of the way. He thought about Caleb, who had come in on a Tuesday afternoon with grease under 2 fingernails and the reservation of a teenager delivered somewhere by an adult's decision, who now came in on Saturdays at 7:25 and stayed until Luke had to tell him directly that the shop was closing and he should go home. He thought about what Marcus Webb had said, give it 5 years. He thought about the notebook on his desk, 94 pages now, names at the top of pages, stories below them, most of the stories incomplete, because the people in them were still inside them, still building toward middles and ends that Luke would only partially see. He thought about Arthur sitting in this same chair, in this same office, writing in his own notebooks, by the same fluorescent light, knowing the same thing, that the work outran the recording of the work, that the ripple was always larger than the stone, that the right response to that fact was not frustration, but a kind of grateful humility before the scale of what was possible when one person decided to keep showing up. He opened the notebook. At the top of a new page, he wrote Caleb's name. He wrote about a 17-year-old with grease under 2 fingernails who had fabricated a washing machine drum bearing from pipe stock with a drill press and a file and 3 days of patience, and who was now at 18 doing primary assembly work on a 1965 Electroglide under the instruction of the finest restoration mechanic Luke had ever watched work. He wrote about what it had looked like last Saturday when Frank had handed Caleb a torque wrench and said without preamble, without ceremony, in the flat declarative tone Frank used for everything, primary cover, torque sequences on the card. Do it right. And Caleb had taken the wrench and crouched beside the machine and done it right. And Frank had watched and said nothing and gone back to his own work, which in Frank's language was the same as saying, yes, exactly. That's correct. You're ready for the next thing. Luke wrote about that for a while. Then he set the pen down. He looked at the journals stacked on the corner of the desk. 12 of them, 40 years of Arthur's careful handwriting. his own notebook beside them, 94 pages, barely the beginning. He thought about something Arthur had written in Journal 11 near the end, in an entry that had no name at the top, just a paragraph dated 4 years before Arthur died, that read like the thing a man writes when he is trying to say something to himself more than to any record. The mission does not require that I see it completed. It requires only that I continue it. The continuation is the completion. Every morning I open this door and someone walks in and I look at what they can actually do and I make a decision based on that. That is the completed work, not the outcome. The decision repeated every day until I am no longer here to make it. And then whoever comes next will open the door and make the same decision. That is all it has ever been. That is enough. Luke had read that passage a dozen times in the past year. It had meant something different each time he read it, which was the characteristic of something true. It grew with the reader rather than staying fixed. He understood it now in a way he hadn't when he'd first read it in October, sitting in Arthur's chair with the fluorescent buzz overhead and $13 gone from his wallet and his whole life rearranged around a locked building on West Broadway. He understood it as the operational definition of what he was doing, not a philosophy, not a mission statement, a daily practice. Open the door. Look at what people can actually do. Make the decision based on that. Repeat. He closed the notebook. He stood up and walked through the dark showroom, familiar now in the way only a place you have moved through thousands of times becomes familiar, the furniture of a life, and unlocked the front door and stepped outside. The November air was cold, genuinely cold, the first hard frost of the season, having arrived 2 nights ago and not retreated. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the sign overhead. Whitmore Harley Davidson, faded letters on aging metal, still moving slightly in the wind on its original brackets. He looked at it for a long time. A year ago, he had stood in almost exactly this spot in October, hold 1 week into owning a building he'd bought for $13, holding the weight of everything Arthur had built, and the question of whether he was the right person to carry it. He had not known the answer then. He had decided to proceed anyway, which was a different thing from knowing. He knew now. Not because the legal fight was won, not because the trust was funded and the compliance reports were filed and the referral network was growing. Not because of the documentary or the specialty press or Marcus Webb's handshake or the traveling man's Road King or the woman in Lolo with her husband's bike. He knew because of Frank handing Caleb a torque wrench and saying, "Do it right." He knew because of what Gloria had said behind a closed door, "I just needed someone to look." He knew because tomorrow morning at 7:30, people who had needed someone to look were going to walk into a building on West Broadway and do work that was genuinely worthy of them. And some of them would eventually leave and take what they'd learned to other places and other people, and the ripple would travel past his range of vision and keep going the way Carolyn had said it would, the way Arthur had always known it would, the way the truth of any real investment in people travels quietly and visibly, without announcement, outrunning every record ever kept of it. He thought about Roy Dempsey arriving tomorrow at 7:27 with his methodical precision and his investment in Isaiah and his floor sweep job that had been his entire professional world 11 months ago. He thought about Caleb arriving Saturday at 7:25 with the grease already under his fingernails from whatever he'd been working on at home, because once a person like that finds the right room, they don't stop when they leave it. He thought about a young man he hadn't met yet somewhere in Montana tonight, whose hands knew more than his circumstances had allowed him to demonstrate who was going to walk through a door on West Broadway eventually and find someone willing to look. He stood in the cold for another moment. Then he went back inside, locked up the shop, and turned off the last light. Tomorrow the door would open at 7:30. It would keep opening every morning for as long as there were people who needed someone to make a decision based on what they could actually do instead of what the world had already decided about them. And in Luke Carter's experience, which now included 42 years of living and 1 year of inheriting the most important education of his life from a dead man's handwriting on an envelope that was going to be a very long time, the mission didn't need a witness. It needed a door that opened every morning, and that door was never going to stop.